In the face of authoritarianism, we display courage and resilience. During times of crisis, we come together in solidarity and cooperation. To ensure our collective security, we collaborate across borders. As new technologies emerge, we harness them for global progress. With a shared history and a common future, we are a transatlantic community built on democratic values, values that unite us. Fostering a new generation fit to lead the Transatlantic Alliance in an increasingly contested world. Join us at CEPA Forum 2021.
Hello, everyone. I am Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to CEPA Forum 2021, Fit to Lead, renewing the Transatlantic Alliance in a contested world. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our supporters for this year's forum, Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. I'd also like to say a special thank you to our colleagues at the Lithuanian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Also, to our media partners, Defense One, Euractiv, and Politico. Thank you so much for joining us at this year's forum. Over the next 3 days, we are going to hear from thought leaders from across the Atlantic as we discuss themes around democratic resilience, transatlantic defense and security, and digital innovation. But first, I'd like to cede the floor to the chair of our board, Mr. Larry Hirsch, and our president and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, to kick off this year's forum. Over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021 CEPA Forum. I'm Larry Hirsch, Chairman of the Board of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. On behalf of the board, I'm delighted to open this year's forum under the theme, Fit to Lead, Renewing the Transatlantic Alliance in a Contested World. Over the years, the CEPA Forum has become a leading platform for thought-provoking discussions, debates, and high-level strategic conversations. And the next 3 days will once again bring together decision makers, industry leaders, and world-renowned thinkers. Indeed, we have much to discuss as a transatlantic community. The forum comes on the heels of the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan, critical elections in Germany, the COVID-19 pandemic, and growing global challenges to democratic values and principles. Since our founding, CEPA has advanced the importance of a strong and enduring transatlantic alliance rooted in a shared commitment to democratic ideals. And while much has changed over the last 16 years, this core mission still holds. We've never shied away from tough questions and innovative ideas, and today, as rising authoritarianism threatens to undermine democratic governance, we ask ourselves, how can we, as an alliance, remain fit to lead? I look forward to hearing from many distinguished leaders, including honorees of this year's Transatlantic Leadership and Freedom Fighter Awards, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and the leader of Democratic Belarus, Svetlana Tsikhanouska. Please join me in the conversation by using hashtag #FitToLead on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, as well as on our website, CEPA.org. Thank you for attention, your support, and most of all, your ideas. And now, on with the show.
Larry, thank you so much for opening this year's CEPA Forum on behalf of CEPA's Board of Directors. Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA. Today, we're truly living through a historic moment. Over the last 18 months, the world has grappled with a global pandemic, natural disasters brought on by climate change, and the end of a 20-year US-led war in Afghanistan. It is too soon to know how history will judge these years. But one thing is already clear. The international order is in a state of flux. And more than that, we are witnessing a profound, long-term transformation of the global order, one that may be defined less by order and more by disorder. The Transatlantic Alliance will have to adapt to a new reality, one in which democratic governance is under stress, digital authoritarianism is on the rise, and predictability is low. Leadership and alliances will matter more than ever, and we, the transatlantic community, will have to ask ourselves, are we fit to lead? The discussions over the next 3 days will seek to answer that key question when it comes to defense, democratic values, and technology. Throughout, one message will come out loud and clear. We must lead with our values. If we fall into the comfort of defining our foreign policy solely in terms of interests, we will fail to prevent the spread of authoritarianism. If we let transactionalism define our alliances, we will fail to stand up for freedom, openness, and individual rights. And if we fail to inspire the next generation of leaders to carry the torch of Atlanticism, to be sure, an instrumental approach to foreign policy that puts values on the backbench will not lead to a more secure, stable, and most of all, more democratic world. An internationalist, not isolationist, foreign policy is the only way to fare through these uncertain waters. Values must guide vision, and vision must guide leaders. This is the message that we hope you will take away from the conversations over the next 3 days. CEPA's mission to strengthen shared transatlantic values and to build, on the basis of those values, a stronger, better, and more resilient alliance of democracies is more relevant than ever. We have seen people's desire for freedom, opportunity, and the ability to choose their own future change the world many times over. From continued protests and opposition in Belarus, to the presidential election in Moldova, to activists fighting against great odds in Hong Kong and Russia, there is real reason for hope. In the long term, oppression will not prevail over freedom. Authoritarianism will not win over democracy. But in the short term, we have a fight ahead. We cannot take the fact that people can live in free societies for granted. We must work together to find the vision, courage, and perseverance to re-energize the democratic values, just as the 1989 freedom fighters did more than 30 years ago. Like them, we have to fight for our democratic future. We hope that the discussions today will inspire you, our audience, and especially those of you young people who might be watching, to reflect on everything that the Transatlantic Alliance has accomplished and to join in our shared fight for democratic values. Thank you for joining us today for the 2021 CEPA Forum.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Alina. And now, before I introduce our distinguished keynote of the day, I would like to introduce a way that you, our audience, can interact with the day's discussions by introducing Slido. Slido is a tool where you can go in and answer your questions, let us know your thoughts. So please go to slido.com, use hashtag CEPA, or scan the QR code on the screen right now for you. We'll start with poll 1 of the day. To strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance, invest in collective defense and security, strengthen democratic institutions, develop the next generation of leaders, or work with Europe. Feel free to go to slido.com, use hashtag CEPA, or scan the QR code to answer today's polls. You can also follow along across all social media platforms using hashtag #FitToLead to let us know your thoughts on today's conversations. And now, it is my honor to welcome President Maia Sandu of Moldova for today's keynote. President Sandu, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to speak at this year's forum of the Center for European Policy Analysis. The overarching theme you have chosen to discuss during these 2 days, and namely the role of leaders in today's contested world, is one that will shape the future of our communities and our relations with each other. We all know that the international rules-based order is currently challenged. The very fabric of democracy is put under question by authoritarian regimes that sometimes can prove more effective at providing quick fixes for problems that otherwise are difficult to solve. This affects both states with strong and weaker institutions. No state is exempted from the threats that democracies have to face today. I would like to focus my address today by sharing with you the example of my own country, the Republic of Moldova. How we managed to get rid of a captured state, what lessons we have learned for ourselves that could be also useful to the others, and how we intend to continue to safeguard and consolidate our young democracy. A month ago, Moldova marked 30 years of independence. These were challenging 3 decades, in which we tried to learn from best international practices how to govern ourselves and build a functional democratic state. We weren't always successful. We passed all written laws, but they largely remained on paper. Our institutions, which were set up based on best practices, were frequently abused. The state could not deliver quality public services. The economy was stifled by monopolies and corruption. As a result, for years, many Moldovans fled the country in search of a better future. Yet, despite difficult times, our citizens did not give up on democracy. We consistently rejected autocratic tendencies of ruling elites, resisted attempts at oligarchic rule, and denounced corrupt practices that impoverished many while enriching only a few. I believe we have succeeded in taking down the authoritarian regimes because we were quick enough to react to them. We contested the regimes before they would become too strong to be taken down. Recent elections have shown that Moldovans share the same objectives for their country. They want freedom, justice, and economic opportunities. During the presidential election last fall, people of different ages and backgrounds came together to demand deep internal transformations that would be first and foremost citizen-oriented. They demanded an end to corruption, a fair trial for everyone, and a clean government that works for the people. I was elected president with a mandate to deliver on these changes. In July of this year, Moldovans reconfirmed their choice by voting for a new parliament that is committed to the same agenda. How did we get to this result? While I credit our citizens with their historic choice, I will share with you our approach. First, We were fair and sincere with the people. We invested a lot in building trust, starting with ensuring total transparency of party and campaign funding and being very honest in our messages. Credibility and integrity are very important, especially when your election program is about fighting corruption and restoring justice. Second, we had the courage to believe, and we worked hard to convince the voters to believe that we can prevail over the corrupt system. Third, unlike other politicians who would divide the society, especially on geopolitical reasons, to collect votes, we came up with a unifying agenda people could get behind. We came together as a team of professionals with integrity as a core value. We recruited energetic, courageous, young people who believe in their country and are ready to work tirelessly to change it for the better. And last but not least, we worked closely with civil society organizations and with our international partners who were just as interested in providing stability and democratization in our region. Our efforts yielded results, but it also gave us valuable lessons about how democracy works. I believe these lessons will ring true in many countries. First, as we have seen time and again, corruption erodes democracy at its core. Corruption makes states poorer and its institutions weaker. It erodes people's trust in their state and its institutions. My country lost tremendous amounts in illicit financial flows through graft, money laundering, and smuggling over the past 30 years. At the same time, as we look at the recent wave of populism across the globe, we can also see that democratic processes are not irreversible, not even in consolidated democracies. In order to deal with the tides of change, we need to strengthen our institutions. We need to become more resilient. Second, building institutions takes time. For Moldova, equally to other countries in the post-Soviet space, 30 years were not quite enough. But investing in institutions that can withstand political shocks is the best thing we can do for our system to hold strong. In that sense, we as politicians must be able to juggle election cycles having long-term goals in mind, growing new generations of leaders, consolidating critical thinking in our society, building independent and accountable institutions, encouraging innovation and research. These are no easy tasks, particularly for young democracies, but we have no other choice. Third, we learned that democracy is fragile against newly emerging tools. Social media platforms have been important global tools for mobilization and democratic organizing, but they can also easily become venues for spreading disinformation that has come to interfere with legitimate political processes such as elections in some countries. These have also harmed Moldova. Still, we have won the last 2 elections despite a lot of fake news and disinformation. I'm wondering whether this happened because Moldovans acquired some immunity to fake news or just because there was too much of it. If we want democracy to thrive, we must work together to prevent information abuse. We must build more resilient societies where our people could better deal with sophisticated tools of manipulation. This means investing more in media education. Fourth, democracies cannot thrive in insecurity. We are concerned with the numerous conflicts arising in the world, in particular with the worsening security situation in our region, in the Black Sea region. As I mentioned during my address to the United Nations General Assembly last week, we are committed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict in the Transnistrian region that would result in a functional and thriving democratic state. More broadly, we want peace and stability in our backyard and in the region as a whole. These are essential prerequisites for the sustainable development of our society and economy. Democracy prevailed in Moldova against many odds, thanks to our people, thanks to their courage to demand a life in dignity and without fear. We must make sure now that we do not slide back again. The solution, as I have mentioned already, lies in building resilient institutions. This entails building an independent, credible, and accountable justice system. It also means revisiting social rules and regulatory frameworks to eliminate opportunities for corruption. It means strengthening independent media and engaging more with civil society. A resilient democracy works if it is based on a citizen-driven agenda and when its oversight institutions can effectively prevent abuse. It also means embracing research and innovation to be able to adapt to modern challenges and working together with international partners to strengthen cooperation on global challenges that cannot be overcome alone. If done right, these measures will restore and strengthen people's trust in democracy again. For a vibrant democracy, trust is the most important precondition of all. In this regard, our number one priority now is to rebuild the trust of Moldovan citizens in their state. We will do so by reducing corruption, cleaning up our public and political systems, and giving the country a chance at a proper, sustainable development. We are also working on rebuilding our rule of law institutions. Every person in Moldova must know that they will get a fair trial and that the court rulings are no longer for sale to the highest bidder. This will lay the foundation also for economic growth and investment. It will allow us to invest in our people by providing better education, healthcare, and infrastructure. We are set to do just that. We must rebuild trust between citizens and state if we want to make Moldova a good place to live in. Many of those who exploited Moldova's resources for years fled the country and took what they stole with them. Some still harbor the idea of coming back or continuing to extract wealth from operating corruption schemes in our shores. I call on our partners to work together to make them stop. We need your help in bringing them to justice and recovering the assets they unlawfully took from Moldova. Ladies and gentlemen, what we learned in 30 years since independence is that democracy is a process rather than a final destination. It can be both resilient and fragile at the same time if institutions are not properly tailored to the fabric of a society. Making it work, defending it, reconfirming our commitment to it requires effort and dedication. Moldovans value democracy and are committed to it. It will take time to make it resilient, but we will take our chance. By listening to the needs of the people, by acting with integrity, by teaming up with energetic professionals who believe in their country and working closely with civil society and with our international partners. Thank you.
Thank you, President Sandu. Democracy is a journey, not a destination. We're so honored that you joined us as our opening keynote for this CEPA Forum. And now, for a segment on leading with our values, it is my honor to introduce Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland and Foreign Minister Anže Logar of Slovenia. And a reminder to all of you to please go to slido.com and ensure that you're answering our questions. Over to you, Senator Cardin, Minister Logar.
Hi, I'm Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. Thank you for having me today at Center for European Policy Analysis for this important forum on renewing the Transatlantic Alliance in a contested world. Under the leadership of Alina Polyakova, the Center has elevated its profile and enhanced its influence as a top-tier policy-relevant think tank. I am glad you invited me to discuss the importance of democratic values in the fight against authoritarianism, because there is nothing more important in the fight against authoritarianism. Democratic values are the bedrock of long-term national security. These values are currently under threat from authoritarian corruption. Corruption poses an existential threat to democratic values. All corruption is a threat to democracy, but the strategic corruption exported by dictators is the greatest threat, since it is targeted and designed to corrode the institutions we hold dear. As demonstrated by President Biden's proclamation in June in National Security Study Memorandum No. 1, that countering corruption is a core U.S. national security interest, and launched the same month of a new Congressional Counter-Kleptocracy Caucus. The two branches of government are aligned in the fight against corruption. The issue is also profoundly bipartisan, a rarity in our polarized time. The dictators want to pick and choose when to have the rule of law. They want to hide their dirty money in the West, where it's protected by the rule of law. At the same time, they bring abusive lawsuits in Western courts. But when it comes to markets they want to be able to manipulate, then they, through bribery or corruption, try to change the rules. The rule of law only works, though, if it's applied equally and everywhere. Otherwise, it's not the rule of law. I've introduced 4 bills in the Senate that I hope will move this agenda forward. The first bill is the Global Magnitsky Act reauthorization, which would make the law permanent and expand its authority. The second is the Combating Global Corruption Act, which would mandate that the State Department create a tiered ranking of countries based on their compliance with anti-corruption commitments and authorize Magnitsky sanctions against those leaders in the lowest tier. The third bill is the Countering Russia and Other Overseas Kleptocracy, the Crook Act. It creates an anti-corruption action fund financed by fines on companies guilty of paying bribes to foreign officials. That would provide ready resources for immediate intervention during historic windows of opportunity for reform. Fourth and finally, I've introduced the Revealing and Explaining Visa Exclusion for Accountability and Legitimacy Act, the REVEAL Act, which will allow the United States to move easily to reveal the names of individuals banned from our shores for human rights abuse and corruption, like those involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and other acts of transnational repression. I would appreciate any help and support so that we can get these measures passed by the Senate and the House and enacted into law this year. Thank you again for the invitation, and I wish you a productive discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to address you today on behalf of Slovenia, which currently holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. I wish to thank the CPAA organizers for the invitation and congratulate them for holding the traditional forum even in these challenging circumstances. Many things have changed since Slovenia's first EU presidency in 2008 in the EU and certainly around the globe. However, I can say that the transatlantic relations are just as prominent to us as they were 13 years ago when Slovenia hosted the EU-United States Summit. Furthermore, we believe that European-American ties need to be even stronger today due to many serious attempts at undermining our shared interests and values and the rule-based international order. Just before our current presidency started, the EU-United States Summit took place in Brussels. The joint statement sets out a clear and ambitious agenda for our common action. For the Slovenian presidency, it serves as a guidance on how to complement our overall priorities with the transatlantic dimension. Allow me to outline these priorities and draw some parallels between the two sides of the Atlantic. Our first priority is strengthening the resilience of the European Union. We want to build on the lessons learned from the pandemic and encourage a horizontal and strategic approach. This emergency needs to be transformed into the EU's long-term crisis preparedness. At the same time, we must enhance the resilience and responsiveness to major cyber attacks and crises. They have revealed our collective vulnerability and underlined the importance of investment in digital security. For resilience to be sustainable, the security element is paramount. In this regard, NATO represents the strongest defense. It is our priority to ensure closer cooperation between the EU and NATO, also regarding the cyber and hybrid threats. Our second priority is the economic renewal of the EU based on the digital and green transition. The pandemic is having a detrimental impact on the social and economic fabric of our societies, and it is crucial to reduce and eliminate its adverse effects. Slovenia plans to work towards Europe's economic recovery, focused on the two main elements of the green transition and digital transformation. With regard to the first, it will be vital to focus on the EU's climate ambitions in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The green transatlantic cooperation in this field, including through the EU-US Climate Action Group, is crucial. As for the digital transformation, let me mention the establishment of the Trade and Technology Council at the EU-United States Summit, which confirms the ever-growing importance of new technologies and the role of digitalization in trade. The EU and the US are by far the biggest digital trade partners. The mere volume of digital trade calls for stability and predictability, including through expanded bilateral trade and investment, avoidance of technical trade barriers, and in particular, cooperation on key policies, technologies, digital issues, and supply chains. The priority of strengthening the Union based on the rule of law and maintaining a European way of life reaffirms joint commitment to our common values of democracy, rule of law, protection of human rights and human dignity, and open market economies. These are cornerstones of our societies and the rule-based international order. The values we share need to be the common denominator in ensuring a sustainable future. Among these, the rule of law has a particularly prominent role. There can be no protection of human rights or democracy or open market economy without it. Slovenia will make every effort to strengthen the rule of law as a common European value, to re-establish the full functioning of Schengen area, and to tackle the open issues of migration and asylum in European and its neighborhood. In connection to the latter, I want to point out our fourth priority, namely a secure European Union as a reliable and good partner in the neighborhood and the world. We believe that a reinforced Transatlantic Alliance should be deeply embedded in advancing the EU security and defense agenda. The unified message of the EU and the United States are important in Slovenia's immediate neighborhood, the Western Balkans. Slovenia will host the EU Western Balkans Summit as we wish to pay special attention to the process of the EU enlargement. The same goes for the European Eastern neighborhood. Our common and unified messages are crucial and they do not go unnoticed. I also wish to emphasize the importance of the established EU-United States dialogue on China and Russia, which now allow for structured and continued exchange on the common approach towards the two. In recent years, weeks and even days, we heard many discussions about divergent views that supposedly harm transatlantic relations and about how the bond between us had weakened. For Slovenia, preserving and strengthening transatlantic partnership and alliance is still the most effective way to build resilient societies able to counter any kind of threat. It is also the best way forward to safeguard our values and our shared objective, free individuals living in a democratic and prosperous society. Let me conclude by saying that differences between us certainly exist, just as they have in the past, and that is completely fine. The ties which bind Europe and North America go way beyond everyday politics. Here history speaks for itself, and so will the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cardin, Minister Logar, for sharing your thoughts with us today. So far, we have highlighted our shared values, our shared democratic values, and the authoritarian threats that endanger those values and those bridges that we have between us. And so at CEPA, we decided to ask top thinkers, what do they think that the international community can do to help activists the world over as they fight for democracy in the face of authoritarianism? It is my pleasure to introduce Ann Applebaum, staff writer for The Atlantic, Craig Newmark, founder of Craigslist and founder of Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Edward Lucas, senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and James Lamont, director for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Over to you.
The best thing the international community can do to support democratic activists around the world is to practice what it preaches. If we uphold political freedom and the rule of law at home, then there's a much better chance that other people will be inspired and want to copy us abroad. Another thing we can do, which is really important to protect democracy around the world, is to punish the people who attack it. We can use asset freezes, we can use visa bans, we can use other means. We have to make it clear to authoritarians and tyrants everywhere that attacking democracy and attacking human rights defenders and democracy activists is not risk-free. It comes with a cost, and we're going to impose that cost.
The other big area for citizens to get involved with to create a resilient democracy is to help respect, build, and rebuild a trustworthy press. I like to say that a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy, and it really took a beating in 2016, did somewhat better in 2020 in the US, but just needs to keep getting better and better.
The most important thing that the international community can do to support democracy activists is to create an international an atmosphere in which modern autocracy finds it much more difficult to operate. I'm thinking about the banking system. I'm thinking about money laundering. I'm thinking about tax havens. One of the one of the elements of Western policy that has been most helpful to the growth and spread of autocracy, and which helps autocrats stay and remain in power, are these elements of the Western financial system. We have allowed them to be used by autocrats and in order to keep and maintain their power. And that has made it very difficult for democracy activists to find space to be active inside their own communities.
Democracies of the world should work together to forge a common strategy to protect against efforts from authoritarian states to intervene in their politics, governance, and information space. We are always stronger when working together.
We can think harder about internet reform and how to regulate the internet. And this I'm saying not because necessarily decisions taken about the internet in the United States will be followed in Russia or Belarus, but because at the very least, we can begin to offer a real alternative. At the moment, the American political conversation is kind of, chaos, trolling, and disinformation campaigns. It doesn't really offer an alternative. It doesn't offer something better that people can look to or turn to. Beginning to think a little bit more about regulating algorithms, or at least understanding them and understanding how they work and monitoring them. Thinking about creating public service alternatives to modern social media. All of that, those are things that may sound distant from democracy activism, but will, I believe, create a more balanced and more intelligent public space. Both, as I said, both the financial sector and the informational sector right now are places where autocrats find it easy to be active. American style and Western style social media has made possible trolling campaigns and spying and surveillance of a kind that was never possible before. And by the same token, the American and Western banking system has made it possible for autocrats to steal, hide, and use money in ways that wasn't before. So I would start really with things that involve in some ways cleaning up our own house. And that I think, begin to make it easier for democracy activists to have successes in other kinds of states.
Democracies of the world should be prepared to address anti-democratic trends within their own borders. A healthy democracy is much more resilient to external pressures than a divided one. Third, democracies of the world should work together to update the international architecture, ensuring that democratic values remain valued on the international stage.
What's coming up fast also are organizations that help people understand how a trustworthy news outlet does its job, and then holds a news outlet to account when sometimes things go wrong. Because sometimes news outlets get things wrong and then they correct them when it's brought to their attention. In the US, the evolving mechanism is called the Trust Project, which helps people hold news outlets to account when things go wrong unintentionally or intentionally. It does have work being done throughout the globe, but also throughout the globe, particularly in Europe, Reporters Without Borders has the Journalism Trust Initiative, which much like in the Trust Project, has a set of model editorial guidelines, basically codes of ethics, so that a news outlet can say, hey, we're going to be trustworthy, here's our principles, and if the news organization has a lapse of behavior, they can be held accountable to that.
The COVID-19 pandemic has been terrible for public health. It's been bad for democracy as well. It's allowed the spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories. It's corroded public trust. It's created great psychological and social stresses, which are really bad for our democratic institutions and our democratic processes. It's also been a huge distraction. All the money and time we spent dealing with COVID is money and time we could have spent doing other things like standing up to autocrats and to tyrants and strengthening the resilience of our system. But there's one plus from the COVID-19 pandemic. It has highlighted the need for international cooperation and the need for resilience. If only we'd shown a bit of that in advance, we might not have been bearing such a heavy price now.
Democracies of the world should work together to update the international architecture, ensuring that democratic values remain valued on the international stage. While it can often feel like today's challenges are insurmountable, we've also seen incredible reason for hope as people from Belarus, Russia, Hong Kong, and so many other places around the world have proven that the desire for democracy and liberty is as strong as ever.
So right now, I think regular people, ordinary citizens, can hold news outlets to account, but new and better means are coming to that end. And between voting, between trustworthy news, that's how regular citizens can promote the resilience of their democracies. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be necessary.
Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who's being honored at this conference, is an example of somebody who wasn't political, wasn't active in politics at all. She didn't think of herself as even being a political person or being part of a political conversation. And one of the effects of the aggression and the change in the nature of the autocracy in Belarus is that it drew, first her husband and then her into politics and then many other people. And so while it is true that autocracies working together, autocracies using the financial system in new ways, autocracies seeking to control and manipulate online and other kinds of conversation are more sophisticated than they used to be, that also means that the reaction is broader and deeper than it used to be as well. I do see a lot of, as I said, either apolitical or ambivalent people being brought into politics in new ways. And that's true, and by the way, in established democracies as well as in autocracies. That seems to be a bright spot, that you see new kinds of activism and new kinds of people being involved in activism who would never have been before.
There's a lot of doom and gloom around, and we've got to be sober in our assessments, but that doesn't mean we have to be pessimistic. I'm thrilled to see Taiwan standing up to the communist authorities in mainland China and showing that a Chinese-speaking country can be a democracy. I'm thrilled to see Lithuania standing up, not just for Taiwan, but for the democratic movement in Belarus, and championing European and Atlantic values. I'm thrilled to see people in so many countries standing up against Russian and Chinese bullying. I'm also glad to see that American democracy has passed the test this January, when we were horrified looking from outside of what was happening on Capitol Hill on January the 6th. It's really good that that's behind us.
Thank you, Anne, Craig, Edward, James. The fight for democracy starts at home, and there are reasons to be optimistic. A brief reminder to you, our audience, to please go to slido.com using hashtag CEPA to answer our poll. Our current question is, what should the Biden administration prioritize to strengthen Transatlantic Alliance? And now it is my honor to welcome those that are on the front lines fighting for democratic values in the face of authoritarianism. We also ask them what the international community can do to support their efforts. Please join me in tuning in to Rushan Abbas, Maxim Bogursov, Anastasia Karimova, Valeriana Kutsova, Alexander Soloviev, and Rahima Mahmoud. Over to you.
As an Uyghur American, I can fully attest that democracy is one of the finest creations of humankind. It ensures that the voice of the people is the driving force of government, the ultimate protection for rights and the security. Today, all over the world, democracy is under attack, as Uyghurs are facing active genocide, while the authoritarian perpetrator remains unaccountable for such crimes. As the genocide has continued for years now, the needed intervention from the international community has been devastatingly slow, but is still desperately needed.
Our country gained independence 30 years ago, and right now we're going through a very painful process adopting democratic values. As a result, we have, as of today, 675 political prisoners, and pretty much every civil society organization, and especially human rights organizations, as well as defense attorneys, are under tremendous pressure. These people very often end up in jail themselves. We'd like to thank the international community for continuous attention to Belarus and to our struggle. We also would like to encourage everybody who has ability to influence or to spend some of their time on Belarus case to bring extra attention to these people individually, so that they know that their sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, is not really going unnoticed by the world.
I've been doing opposition politics for more than 10 years and was planning to become a candidate in parliamentary elections 2021 in Russia. But the authorities started jailing most of us, so unfortunately I had to leave country at least for some time. So, how can the international community support democracy activists? Well, to be honest, there are not so many ways left, but I'll try to focus on a couple of them. First one is more of a global strategic thing. You know, no matter how paradoxical it may seem, but not all of the European and Western leaders seem to understand whom they're dealing with when they try to deal with Vladimir Putin. It is no longer possible to have any organization within Russia, any legal entity, any movement on uniting independent candidates or opposition activists. There are only individuals left. But that doesn't mean they can't be supported.
The international community must acknowledge that the Chinese regime is committing genocide against my people. It must then meet its responsibilities in preventing that genocide from taking place any longer. Corporations, from clothing to tech to catch up, must wash their hands and their supply chains of Uyghur forced labor and repressive surveillance technology. Governments can and must do more to condemn genocidal states like China. Trade deals should not be seen as more important than democracy and human rights. There is so much more our governments could do to prevent the genocide: import controls, diplomatic pressure, coordinated sanctions.
Больш за ўсё, як на мяне, ён баіцца нашай салідарнасці. Найбольш страшна яму, што за гэты год з народа мы зрабіліся нацыяй. І тут у нашых галовах гэта ўжо не памяняць. Гэта першая перамога. Другі этап, ён складанейшы. Ён наперадзе. Барацьба з дыктатурай – гэта не спрынт, гэта марафон, на які, магчыма, мы не разлічвалі. Але ад таго нельга ўсё адно спыняцца. Я упэўненая, што наша галоўная сіла цяпер у тым, што мы разам, што мы солидарны, што мы ёсць аднадумцамі.
Journalists in authoritarian countries face incredible censorship. The Western media have power that we don't have. Please, keep calling the dictators out. The second thing that I'd like to mention is funding. I would like to encourage the Western donors who work in the field of political development to reconsider their funding priorities. Most donors are very impact-driven and change-oriented. But unfortunately, in authoritarian countries, you cannot expect quick change. Sometimes activists need resources to just survive, to maintain their knowledge and skill set, and be able to transfer it to new generations.
For too long, we have seen activists silenced through intimidation tactics. Their families taken, used to speak against them. Their pictures shown at press conferences and their reputations defaced online. The result of this is a chilling effect on the dissent, which ripples across our globe, holding many captives outside of China's borders. To this day, we have not seen my sister's face. She is paying the price for my activism, while her daughters and granddaughters reckon with the agony of having their innocent mother abducted by the Chinese state and imprisoned on false charges. Activists like myself are facing a giant in taking on the CCP. We are underfunded and facing deliberate attacks on our character, even hacking attempts, while the world continues to treat the Chinese regime as an international equal.
And not so many things that may help Russian society from outside. No, it's only up to us, but if you can make every politician from a country with a strong democratic institutions start their dialogue with their Russian counterparts from for instance, naming political prisoners and the details of their cases, that might probably help. Knowing the details of different cases where the Kremlin lies is very important. You must be prepared for the propagandist cliché in order to show the whole world how exactly they are lying. That may even be more important for your societies. Also, keep working on personal sanctions. Being Russian citizen, I cannot support economic ones because they harm the whole country and the whole population eventually. The regime doesn't care about the population. They can easily compensate their losses by imposing new taxes, charges, fees, and making my country fellows poorer. But when it comes to something personal, oh, believe me, that works. Sometimes everything they have, everything they've stolen, is being kept in your countries. But placing the exact official in a sanction list is no longer sufficient. You need to conduct a classic police investigation in order to define all the cronies. Don't forget their nature. They are criminals.
The international community must refuse to validate states that are violating the human rights of people in their territories. In allowing China to host the Olympics, the IOC has gifted them a propaganda exercise. The world must wake up and stop rewarding genocidal states with prestigious international events. Our global community is made up of individuals. Those individuals can get engaged. They can fight for democracy alongside us, use their buying power, lobby their parliamentarians, demand change. We can all play a role in ending the Uyghur genocide, and that means we all have a responsibility to speak out.
Please consider supporting democracy activists, even if they cannot promise the immediate institutional change. Many pro-democracy activists have to leave their home countries because it is too dangerous to stay. They need visa support, they need work authorizations, and they need integration into Western societies. The vast majority of political refugees want to come back to their home countries when it gets safe again. But please, help them survive this difficult time in exile. Help them learn from their American and European peers, and help them use this time in exile to advocate for human rights at the international level. Last but not least, and here I'm talking specifically about Russia, please help us quicken the collapse of Putin's regime. We hope that our partners in the West will introduce targeted sanctions against Russian government officials who are found to be violating human rights and international law.
Again, we're going through a level of repressions that this country hasn't seen probably since Second World War. It's a completely new territory for us. At the same time, people really committed to do everything they can to help Belarus to go and continue into evolve, becoming a democratic country in the world.
Rushan, Maxime, Alexander, Anastasia, Valeriana, Rahima, thank you so very much for joining us at this year's CEPA Forum. And now our first polls results are it. Let's take a look. Fantastic. And so as a reminder, the question was, what should the Biden administration prioritize to strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance? And it seems that strengthen democratic institutions is the leading answer over invest in collective defense and security, which was a close second. Thank you so much. Develop the next generation of leaders there, work with Europe on tech policy. But it seems that strengthen democratic institutions is the lead on this question. Now I'm happy to introduce the next poll, or actually word cloud. Again, go to slido.com, use the hashtag CEPA. And the question is, what is the biggest challenge facing democracy today? Again, slido.com, use the hashtag CEPA, or scan the QR code, and the word cloud is, what is the biggest challenge facing democracy today? Now, before I introduce our panel, I would like to just say thank you again to this year's CEPA Forum supporters, Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. And also a special thank you to our colleagues at the Lithuanian Embassy in Washington, D.C. and the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. To our media partners, thank you for joining us in this effort, Defense One, Euractiv, and Politico. And with that, I'm very pleased to welcome the chair of our next panel, State of the World Disorder, David Herzenhorn, Chief Brussels Correspondent at Politico. David, over to you.
Thanks, Kim. Welcome, everyone. Thanks, Keisha, to the opening panel of this year's forum, State of the World Disorder. I'm David Herzenhorn, Chief Brussels Correspondent for Politico Europe, but joining you today from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the rain seems to have chased me all the way from Belgium. Good morning to those of you joining us here in the US, and good afternoon to all of our friends in Europe. And I'd like to start by thanking, of course, Alina Polyakova and her entire team at the Center for European Policy Analysis. CEPA, of course, is devoted to promoting close ties and enduring ties between Europe and the US. And at Politico Europe, we believe one of the most important of those enduring ties is the unwavering commitment to media freedom. And when Politico decided to go global, its first stop was Brussels, where we've been hard at work creating a unique pan-European and transatlantic media space. So please do read us at politico.eu. I'll make some quick introductions right now, and then we'll jump into our conversation today. I'm joined by H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, now Fouad and Michel Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, by Bobo Lo, Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundations. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We'll start right quick with General McMaster to talk about the role of the U.S. in the world at the moment. I know you have talked about Afghanistan as a humanitarian catastrophe. Also, it's viewed certainly in Europe now as a failure on multiple fronts, a failure of intelligence, a policy failure, a failure of military planning. That has really shaken confidence, especially among European allies. In recent days, EU leaders have made clear they view Joe Biden not as starkly in contrast with Donald Trump, as the current White House might hope, but rather as a pattern that began with George W. Bush, an instinct toward unilateralism in Washington, a penchant for making a bit of a mess of things in the global arena. An essential question: can the US still claim to be the leader of the free world, a trusted ally, the sole superpower willing to act as a guarantor of democratic freedoms? Or has American credibility eroded to the point that Washington is no longer the center of gravity in world affairs? Is there a world order in 2021? General Professor McMaster, take it away.
Well, David, hey, thanks. It's great to be here. Great to be part of anything that CEPA does. And I just want to thank the whole CEPA team for the great work that they do. Alina, I mean, I really think the world needs CEPA more than ever. I would just say that what's the alternative, David? You know, what's the alternative? You know, I think the way that you framed the question is indicative of this, this concept of strategic narcissism, our tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and then assume that what we do or decide not to do is decisive toward the outcome. Others have agency. Others have authorship over the future, and those others include brutal enemies, as well as adversaries and rivals internationally. So I think it's time really for all of us to take stock, because what we see in Afghanistan is a failure, I think, primarily of will, right? A failure of will, across all of humanity, right? To confront the enemies of all civilized peoples. And because of our self-referential nature, right? This tendency towards strategic narcissism, we have vacated critical competitive spaces under the belief that if we disengage, everything will be okay. And what you see in Afghanistan, I think, is really self-defeat, based on self-delusion, right? And just think about the assumptions that underpinned the precipitous withdrawal and essentially really a surrender to a jihadist terrorist organization. The first of these assumptions, I think, is that the Taliban would put in some sort of more benign form of Sharia, right? And we actually conjured up the enemy in Afghanistan that we would prefer rather than the actual enemy that we were fighting. Second is related to that is that the Taliban is separate, right, from other jihadist terrorist organizations, including Al Qaeda. Which of course is not the case. They're utterly intertwined. I mean, Siraj Haqqani is now in charge of security in Afghanistan. And I think the third, and what is probably most important among these assumptions, is that when you lose wars, there's no consequence. So as we're watching the humanitarian catastrophe, the political catastrophe associated with really our reputation, not only the United States, but I think the Western world's reputation, and the security catastrophe, which is just now beginning in terms of the strengthening of jihadist terrorist organizations, you have to ask the question, what do we do? Well, I think we first of all have to recognize the competitive nature of foreign policy, of international security and war, and I think what we've done is we've relearned, the lesson that lost wars have consequences. And really in the United States, across really 3 administrations, we had 3 leaders in a row tell the American people, hey, it's not worth it. Really, we just need to disengage from Afghanistan. So I think we ought to remember what G.K. Chesterton said about war, is a war may not be the best way of settling differences, but it might be the only way to ensure they're not settled for you. And so I think we really need to examine really the sources of will, and to hold our leaders accountable for what is only the beginning of a humanitarian, a political, and a security catastrophe in Afghanistan.
Thanks so much. Some very sobering thoughts there. And with Europe talking so much about the need for strategic autonomy, maybe on the U.S. side, you're suggesting a need to talk about strategic humility to counter that narcissism that you talk about. Let's turn to Bobo. Bobo Lo, you've been thinking and talking about the world disorder for quite some time. It's not a new world disorder for you by any means. And I want to challenge you a little bit by coming at this from a different perspective, which is on other fronts. Haven't we seen actually this chaotic, disordered world on the pandemic, for instance, come together and find ways to manage a health crisis, not perfectly by any means, but certainly better than has been seen across human history, finding ways to mitigate the loss of life? Are we, in fact, seeing Europe step up, for example, with exports of vaccines, the effort to coordinate donations to other countries? Again, not perfect, but is there now some glimmer of hope in all this, that there is some new order coming following the disorder that you've described, where Russia and China are sort of exploiting missteps by the US or wherever there's a vacuum to gain benefit for themselves? Take it away.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think we have belatedly seen some level of multilateral cooperation in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Because what global challenges like coronavirus, climate change, what they show is that these are universal problems. These are problems that transcend national and ideological boundaries. So they are collective problems, and therefore they require collective solutions. And indeed, that's been demonstrated by the effective development of vaccines. However, I also think that COVID-19 has brought out the worst in many countries. It has demonstrated for more than 18 months, I would argue, that most governments operate according to narrow self-interest rather than universal norms. So I think we have a bit of a contradictory picture here. The problem is collective, the problem is global. We need to address it collectively and globally. And yet that is not what has happened in many cases. Now, I just want to sort of jump from there to thinking about understanding what I mean by global disorder. Of course, we've had chaos and wars and anarchy in the past. But I think in the past, we have actually had some form of order. Of course, this order was imperfect, but there was some kind of order. I think the world today is more chaotic and anarchic and disorderly than at any time since the late 18th century. And what do I mean by that? What defines a global disorder? Well, I think first, there is a lack of agreement and clarity over the rules of the international system. And therefore, we have rules breaking on a serial scale. It's unclear what the rules are, what moral authority underpins those rules, and to whom they apply, when and where. We are seeing the de-universalization of international norms. We have seen the much diminished authority of great powers. We talk about living in an age of great power rivalry, but the paradox, the irony is that the great powers have never been weaker in their ability to impose their will on others or even persuade them, and they've never been weaker in terms of global problem solving. We are seeing the widespread denigration of multilateral institutions, a crisis of leadership, worse, I would say, than at any time since the 1930s. We live in a hyper-globalized world, but also one that is fragmenting. Amidst intensifying conflicts over ideology, identity, and culture. And of course, we live in an anarchic information space dominated by competing truths. And all this is happening when we in the world are facing enormous challenges, accelerating climate change, the aggravation of global poverty and inequality, the sharp escalation of great power confrontation, and of course, the devastating impact of the coronavirus. We live in an age of breakneck technological and informational transformation. And now we think, well, is someone ready to lead? Can someone lead the international community in addressing all these problems? Well, there should be a leader, but there isn't. Because I think US global leadership is over. Joe Biden can talk about America is back, but what does back mean? Does that back mean as a committed player on the international scene, or does he mean America is back to lead the world? Because unfortunately, America has neither the credibility, the capacity, nor the will to lead the world. And second, very few countries, including many of America's allies, look to Washington for global leadership. They want an active, committed, engaged America, but that is not the same thing as wishing to follow America. So while the United States remains the preeminent global power by just about every criterion you care to name, in general, power has become much more disaggregated and diffuse. And what this means is that there is no global leader nor global leaders. I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks so much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the recent controversy just in recent days about the new regional alliance in the Indo-Pacific between the US, UK, and Australia. You're a former Australian diplomat. You know all these countries very well. And what do you make of that? Was that an effort in Washington to change the channel, so to speak, from Afghanistan very quickly? Or is this showing us that, in fact, the strategic decisions will be made on a very regional basis? looking at specific geographic locations or specific issues. Partnerships will happen sort of in this ad hoc way, but sometimes, as we saw, leaving out key partners on in other areas or historic allies.
I think you've answered your own question there. I think countries, including the United States, are taking an increasingly a la carte approach to multilateralism. So, for example, the Biden administration has gone down the route of caucusing in small groups or smaller groups of like-minded countries. And now the Quad is an example of this. AUKUS is another. But I actually think that that shift is not particularly new, because it seems to me that Biden is effectively following in the footsteps of George W. Bush's coalition of the willing. Because as in the Bush era, Washington's thinking appears to be that marshalling a larger international consensus is virtually impossible, and therefore the best option is to rally like-minded countries in support of US interests. So with AUKUS, I think the AUKUS controversy reveals several things. I think first it reveals that Biden, rather like Trump, will act in what he perceives to be America's best interests. And second, it shows that China is the all-consuming priority of the Biden administration. Now, for the UK, AUKUS is about global Britain. And why is global Britain important? Well, it's really about, in a sense, it's a Britain raging against the dying of the light. It's desperate to show that it still matters on the world stage. And AUKUS, and for example, gestures like sending the Queen Elizabeth carrier group to the Western Pacific, they're all part of reinforcing that message. Now, for Australia, as an Australian, AUKUS is about security in the deepest sense of the word. And that means binding the United States as closely to us as possible. Now, of course, upsetting the French is awkward, it's embarrassing, but the strategic and emotional rationale for favoring AUKUS was irresistible. Now, it seems to me that all the parties, Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, they underestimated the extent of the French reaction. But frankly, the bottom line is, I don't think they're that bothered. They believe that Paris will come around eventually, especially as China continues to push increasingly aggressively in the Indo-Pacific region.
And that's a perfect cue as we start to talk about France to turn to Daniela to come in with a bit of a European perspective here. There was a book review not too long ago in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung that said, had a nice line about how Russia can never be what it wants to be, and Germany doesn't want to be what it could be. The General McMaster talked about other countries have agency here, other capitals. We can include the EU as a world capital there. How and when, or will they ever take the agency that would seem to be theirs for the grabbing in this moment of chaos? Is Europe ready to step up? Is there more of a reason for Washington's snub of France than anybody wants to admit, that in fact the view is they won't? Daniela, please.
Thanks, David. Well, I would say Europe is trying, but not maybe trying at its best at the moment. So I think we've seen quite an evolution of the inner European debate of our own international role. And Donald Trump's presidency, of course, helped a great deal. He was the US president which actually made Europeans take a major step on defense cooperation. However, if you look at it in substance, it doesn't make such a huge difference because it is still entirely the member states who provide the necessary capacities. However, I need to say that after Afghanistan and AUKUS over the past weeks, this debate has again gained pace. And what we see in Europe, and this has been around very traditionally for several decades, but more so over the past 3-4 years, as Europe has more intensely discussed the concept of strategic autonomy, that in particular France and Germany have two rather contrasted ideas of what this, defense cooperation in Europe might actually be. Germany has put a lot of effort together with the European Commission and others to start building structures for defense cooperation for the EU as a pillar or in addition to NATO. And if you listen to the French, their conclusion is far more, we don't need institutions, not really, not that much. We don't need large groups. Germany made sure we now have 25 member states in the Structured Defense Cooperation called PESCO. The French rather look at smaller battle group style corporations, which can be, sent out swiftly and are very flexible. And I guess the truth is somewhere in the middle. Europe is now, I think, politically much further towards the recognition that Europe has to build own capacity to act in the field of defense, in the broader field of security, and in other areas. And if we needed another wake-up call, it was definitely Afghanistan and AUKUS, but really the Trump presidency and the recognition that it is actually possible that the US revisits very substantively the security guarantees provided to Europe, which we were able to, for decades, to in a way lie back on. This has changed the debate. However, and that's, I think, very important to recognize, we are here speaking about the core of national sovereignty. So what we will not see in a long time is some kind of deep integration, but we will see, I hope, more structured, more strategic cooperation. And one important element that will be published or put forward this year, not all of it obviously will be published, but part of it maybe, the so-called strategic compass, which is really the base of any strategic reflection in the EU, because right now, member states, and they will continue to, still have very diverse risk assessments and a very diverse view of the world, what matters. For the Baltic states and Poland, the top of list item would be obviously Russia. For Southern European member states, it would be North Africa. For France, it would probably be North Africa and terrorist threats coming from the Middle East, simply because of the own experience on French territory. And so the important first step really is to not, to level down those risk assessments, but to enhance the comprehension among Europeans, what everyone sees and what everyone wants to act upon, and then think much more strategically about the instruments that we need as Europeans to at least provide stability and the necessary prerequisites in terms of security in our own neighborhood and for the EU.
It's interesting, as you describe those regional differences within the EU member states, the threats that they perceive, China doesn't come up, as opposed to where we see now the US being singularly focused. I mean, of course, it does come up, but China, it's not the primary.
No, China comes up a lot. I've been speaking now more about the more traditional, let's say, physical threats, but China is obviously a huge topic. And here again, the EU has moved forward. What is China for Europe? China is a partner, of course. It's an economic partner. And speaking to you from Berlin, I'm in the capital of the EU, where economic ties with China are, of course, very, very close, strategically built over years, and where it is very hard to suddenly shift gears and say, oh, China's not only a partner, but China's also a systemic competitor, and maybe also an adversary. And of course, I mean, in terms of hybrid, if you talk hybrid in Europe, China has risen, for I would say 5-10 years back would have been Russia that had come top of list. Now China, which in some ways has more sophisticated ways of hybrid intervention, is there, of course, seen, discussed, and of course, preventive and protective measures are put into place. And then obviously China works in particular as an economic and political actor within the borders of the EU, trying to exert political influence, trying to prevent votes that displease Beijing in the EU, but also in the United Nations when it comes to human rights issues. And right now we very well know how, I would say, those vulnerabilities have been underestimated for quite a long while in the EU. And final point on China, I would say progress has been made not only in this area of protection, for instance, the Investment Screening Act that the EU now has, which has been translated into national laws, the new initiatives to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, in particular in the Eastern neighborhood and into Central Asia. All this is there, but what is now new and very recent is that the EU is also coming forward with an Indo-Pacific strategy, where China, of course, is the elephant in the room. And Germany, allied with other EU member states who have had their Indo-Pacific strategies out for a long time, and have military presence, such as France or the UK. Germany is now sending its first frigate, Bavaria, its name, to the Indo-Pacific. And this is, I mean, it may look symbolic, but it is an expression of, I would say, the beginning of a fundamental rethink, how we have to look at Asia and how we have to do more than just look at China.
But maybe I can ask you a question I was asking some of the EU leaders in New York last week, which is if France had been invited, if any of Europe had been invited into this AUKUS proposal, should the EU have wanted in, or does the EU have a different notion of how to approach China policy, that in fact they might not want to be part of this, what seems to be a very confrontational policy, but to cut a different path that, as the European Council President Charles Michel suggested, maybe takes more of the economic relations into account? Of course, Washington might say the EU takes too much of the economic relationship into account.
Sorry, was that a question back to me?
That was back to you, Danielle. Yeah, if they should have,
sorry,
should they have wanted to be part of
a-
it? Then I have another one for General McMaster, and we'll come back right around.
Yeah, well, Europe definitely has a different approach than the US, and that's very clear. I mean, we have a different relationship with China, and hence the options that Europeans can and want to put on the table with regards to more confrontational approaches are different ones. And this is true both for the economic debate and the whole decoupling debate that in particular Trump really launched, and where Europe said, oh, wow, that we only have, we have something to lose here big time because of mutual investment, because of trade ties, and so on, and because of dependence on China in strategic points or very vulnerable points in our value chains, and with regards to the provision of important technologies and so on. So if Europe changes its approach towards China, this can by definition only go more slowly. And as I said, I think it has already started. And the COVID-19 crisis really accelerated this debate. The value chain discussion that we have right now, the provision of health products, really the list of what is critical industry has grown far longer. And Europeans think about their own provisions and that way about their own security in a much more holistic way. And when it comes to military presence, of course, I mean, European military presence compared to US military presence in the Indo-Pacific is far less developed. But there is also a far, I would say, bigger caution to even think about a bigger military presence, because I would say the concern about an escalation by those measures is more developed in Europe. And there is no, I don't know whether this exists in the US, but at least for Europe, I would say there's no real clarity on where we would actually go if China did cross red lines in the Indo-Pacific. What would we be ready to do militarily? Not sure the US is clear, but I would definitely say for the Europeans, there's not that much clarity that we should maybe have.
Well, thanks so much. I want to come back to General McMaster, because you made this point that 3 presidents have suggested that it wasn't worth it in Afghanistan. We know that whatever conclusions the American president of the moment makes, it's not for lack of great advice. Some of the best advice in the world comes to that desk where the tough decisions have to be made. You were in that role. And I wonder if you could share some thoughts with us about, given the strategic narcissism that you described, given the state of the world disorder that Bobo has described, what would you advise at this point? How does America reposition itself? What would you tell the current president or any president about where they should the directional shift that might be needed? And is there an issue of consistency where whatever you want to say about Russia over the long term, China over the long term, there's a certain direction that they stick the ground, whereas our system, the American political system, allows for a swinging of the pendulum, whether that's on JCPOA or whether that's on anything else, the ability to do and undo. What would be your prescription, if you could share with us shortly, or how do we get back on track?
Well, I mean, I don't think the presidents get the best advice a lot of times. I think a lot of presidents come into the job wanting to to hear the advice that they would prefer, and I wrote a book about this, about how and why Vietnam became an American war. And when I was National Security Advisor, I was determined not to at least make the same mistakes. And on Afghanistan, we presented Donald Trump with his preferred option up front. This is what withdrawal from Afghanistan at any cost looks like. And in August of 2017, he made a much different decision than he made later, which was to begin the capitulation negotiations in 2019 that resulted in essentially a surrender agreement with a terrorist organization in February of 2020. President Biden doubled down on that. President Biden had said when he was vice president that he thought that the best military advice he was receiving was boxing in him as vice president and President Obama. Well, if you believe that, and you have tremendous confidence in your decisions, regardless of the analysis you receive, you make decisions like Donald Trump and like Joe Biden. And so I think that this is a failure of executive leadership. It's a failure of leadership overall to generate the will that's necessary. And I think this is relevant to Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And I'd just like to, I'll tell you, I mean, I'm listening to this conversation. I've got to tell you, I mean, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but there's no such thing as an international community, right? It doesn't exist. Okay, we're talking about it and we're lamenting its demise, but it has never existed in human history. And until that we recognize that we are in a competitive international environment, and that with those who are, lamenting the loss of American leadership, ought to also recognize that there are actors in the world who are not waiting to be led by the United States. And therefore, we ought to put a higher premium on cooperation among like-minded nations who are bound together by common principles and values. And this is where I think Europe is lacking. I mean, we are lamenting, U.S. withdrawal from leadership in the world, and Germany doesn't even spend 1% of its GDP on defense, while the United States has committed to a European deterrence initiative where we rotate forces to the Baltic states, that the cost of which to the American taxpayer is like 33% of Germany's entire defense budget. Right? So when is Europe going to wake up? I mean, Europe talks about like strategic autonomy in a way that suggests some moral equivalence with the Chinese Communist Party, and then complains about the lack of U.S. leadership and consultation on issues. I mean, I think it's really astounding, the degree to which we are, I think, engaged in self-delusion about the nature of competitions, especially, I think, with China from an economic perspective. And already this discussion, like so many discussions, has framed this discussion about, like, gosh, Donald Trump was just so mean. And can you believe, how the China-U.S. rivalry has got us like caught in the middle, right? This is the narrative of Europe and strategic autonomy. Well, let's just consider what's happened since COVID-19. How about foisting a pandemic on the world, right? By suppressing news of human-to-human transmission, by bludgeoning and suppressing journalists and doctors who tried to ring the alarm bells. How about adding insult to injury with the wolf warrior diplomacy we've seen around the world? How about the physical aggression that we've seen with bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? The building and weaponization of violence in the South China Sea, ramming and sinking vessels in the South China Sea. The threats to Taiwan, the violations of airspace against Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. How about really a massive campaign of cyber espionage against our medical research facilities in the midst of the pandemic? How about a campaign of economic coercion against Australia, and to kill one to kind of scare 100? So I'll tell you, I just don't think we're serious people. We're not competing, and we talk about these ideas of like the international community and the U.S. leaving leadership. Well, how about each of our countries, really stepping up a little bit and recognizing the nature of the threat of the Chinese Communist Party? And we are so self-referential, and Danielle made some great points here. But we're talking about how we are prioritizing decoupling. Are we not listening to Xi Jinping? Xi Jinping's agenda is decoupling, but he just wants to decouple on his own terms after extracting as much as he can out of the West to be in a position of preponderant power, not only across the Indo-Pacific, but internationally, and dominating supply chains and dominating advanced manufacturing and dominating the data-driven emerging global economy. So, I just don't think we deserve, to succeed here unless we wake up and begin competing and stop this self-referential, sort of approach to the world.
I want to invite Bobo and Daniela to jump in at any point, but one thing you're saying is, as you speak, that I'm thinking of is, the international community is there for the taking. If the G7, the complaint.
No,
from the
it doesn't
EU leaders
exist. It will never exist.
That they thought they had
it will
an agreement
never exist. It will
on how to
never
confront
exist.
China in a unified way, and then the U.S. went on its own. And so this is the question. And
No,
I wonder,
no,
as
come
Bobo jumps
on,
in,
come
is
on.
NATO
This
the
is
biggest
nonsense.
loser here?
This is
because
utter.
in fact, that of all the fictions, the one that is showing up to have perhaps the least teeth of all is that perhaps NATO. Bobo, you wanted to jump in. Go right ahead.
I'd like to pick up on a few points here. Look, I completely agree with General McMaster that this talk about international community is extremely unhelpful. I think one problem that we have when we discuss international relations is we use all these terms like rules-based international order, the free world, international community, or authoritarian model of governance. We throw around these labels, but we never really have a clear idea of what we mean by them. They've become platitudes, cliches, bromides, and we really need to sort of think about what do we want to achieve. Now, it seems to me that global governance is so lagging behind the demands placed in front of us and governance itself. And so that we really have to rethink the nature of global governance and the mechanisms of global order. Now, of course, this is going to be incredibly difficult. It's natural to lapse into fatalism and say, we're doomed to this sort of mano a mano sort of confrontation between the United States and China. And that is important. But global order and disorder is so much more than just geopolitical competition. And we really should be prioritizing what I see as a 21st century global agenda, accelerating climate change, tackling rising poverty and inequality, technological transformation, global health, the information revolution, because these are the clear and present dangers of our time and also in coming decades. And they are vastly more relevant to the mass of humanity than great power geopolitics. Now, we need to get rid of the presumption of a natural born US global leadership. And I agree with General McMaster. It's so easy to lapse into self-referencing here. But we need to get real and rather than realist. It's time to dump the notion that the world revolves around great powers. There is zero future in some kind of great power arrangement. We are not living in 1815. We are not in Vienna. The world is vastly too complex. And it worries me that we focus so much. We've gone from this extraordinary transformation. From 1989, we were saying, geopolitics doesn't matter. It's not important. The end of history, the end of geopolitics. That was rubbish then, but we're now going to the opposite extreme, like thinking that geopolitics is the clear consuming priority of our times. It is for many policymakers and thinkers, but it is not for most of humanity. And
but you often say that the problems are globalized, that there is a need for international cooperation, because I throw into there the question of how's going it alone working for the Brits, where you are now. So just keep going. So explain. Okay. So what is, if we believe General McMaster, and we do, that the global, this notion, it's a fiction, but you're saying there is a need for a strategy. What does that look like?
Okay. So if you're,
Hey guys, I think it looks like AUKUS, right? Everybody's lament. It looks
but
like
that's Anglophone. That's
like-minded
English-speaking.
countries.
Only go with the allies that speak your language.
Why is AUKUS an issue?
Countries
who share interests and have complementary capabilities come together to really cope with a well-defined problem of Chinese aggression, right? Why is that an issue? So I just think it's really coalitions of like-minded countries who come together to really try to help solve problems.
But not just. You see, I see the future of multilateralism as really a network of institutions and processes and mechanisms. So there will be the Quad, AUKUS, but there'll also be the UN Security Council, there'll be the ICAO, there'll be UNCLOS, there'll be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there'll be ASEAN, the EU, NATO. It's, you know, we've got to be careful not to be overly prescriptive here. Really, I think there'll be many issues which, there'll be many organizations and mechanisms that will be issues and interests based rather than values driven. This is natural. This is the way of the world. But I just wanted to come back to
hey, Bobo, hey, how about this though? How about World Health Organization? You mentioned ICAO. How about Human Rights Council, right? I mean, so this idea that there's a prize for membership in these organizations, I think is kind of ludicrous, right? These international organizations are competitive spaces. And we've seen the Chinese Communist Party actually turn a lot of these organizations against their very purpose. And
You're
so,
absolutely right.
So I think it's important to recognize the competitive nature, which sounds like geopolitics to me, Bobo. You know what I mean?
It's not just, but my
but
point
also
is
important to ask, where will the decisions be made and who will make them?
Different decisions will be made at different levels in different organizations. You see, there is no global hegemon anymore. There's not even a concert of great powers. Power, as I mentioned, has become much more disaggregated and diffuse. So different decisions will be made with different levels of effect. But, you know, General McMaster is right. We do live in a bitterly competitive and often confrontational world. But that does not mean that we cannot cooperate on certain issues. In a way, the EU sort of summation of their relationship with China, partly partner, partly competitor, partly systemic rival, you know, is right. China is all those things. What worries me sometimes is that often we just have a one-dimensional view of China. We have a monolithic view of China. And we need to be a sort of, I think, you know, life is more complex. There are more variations. But I also wanted to pick up, if I may, just pick up one more point, that it's very easy for us to scapegoat Russia and China because so many of their actions have been utterly despicable and egregious, and I'm no way seeking to defend that. But it worries me that we are not taking a good hard look at our own suicidal statecraft. The fact is that we have, for the best part of 15 years, not practiced the values that we preach to others. The fact that our policy making, decision making has been so inept in so many areas, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, global financial crisis, COVID-19. The fact that we are seeing a hollowing out of liberal norms within our own societies and therefore disenchantment with liberal values. These are fundamental problems. China and Russia have exploited our failings, but they did not create them in the first place.
But what I wanted to ask is, don't human beings crave leadership? General McMaster talked about presidents wanting to make the decision they wanted to make in the first place. Sometimes as a journalist, I complain that no matter what we write, the readers believe what they believed in the first place, only more so. And I want to let maybe Daniela jump in here, because don't human beings crave the steady hand of the general who is capable, the inspirational leader who's shown experience and wisdom? This is the week when we see Angela Merkel's successor, maybe kind of sort of having been chosen. Is there anyone out there that you three see who can lead the world's population in this direction of partnership to convince folks? Because in the end, they don't believe in the WHO or in NATO or in the UN Security Council. They turn to their leaders for the leadership that General McMaster said is so sorely lacking on this complex, disordered world stage. Maybe Daniela, do you have a thought? And jump in, Bobo and General, at any point.
It's of course always good to have clarity, to have a center of power and to know who's accountable, but the world is quite different at the moment. And if I speak to this from the European perspective, you see very different things happening at the same time. One is, of course, that some countries, and Bobo spoke about backsliding of democracy and liberal values. We see countries that are turning authoritarian within the borders of the European Union and questioning those fundamental values that the EU is based on, like Hungary, like Poland. So there you see an appetite, because those leaders have been re-elected already, for a strong and even authoritarian leadership, which is, of course, for the EU a problem. And that was, I think, what Bubu was aiming at. If we then have an ambition in leading change in neighboring countries or being a model region for others in the world that look at us. They still do, but we really have to be careful that we don't lose because of those internal developments. On a global scale, I mean, in my view, we very clearly have power competition, and Europe does sit in the middle. We see how other powers are trying to develop their influence within our own borders and how they try with all kinds of means, and I spoke about hybrid earlier, build more influence in our neighborhood for political reasons, for economic interests, for many, many reasons. So I do think we live in an era of competition for influence for some, and between some it is, in my view, fundamental systemic competition. And this plays out in areas, I mean, we have briefly touched upon a number of international institutions where this plays out. But I would say also it plays out greatly in the sphere of technology, where we really have to be, first of all, aware that technological leadership can be weaponized, and that we, and here I'm speaking about the political West and not only Europe, if we don't pay attention to the whole regulatory framework that we need to put in place so that technology doesn't undermine our principles of democracy and civil rights, for instance, I think then we really miss something. And that's where Europe comes in again for final thought, because I know we're running short of time. Europe has lost competitive edge as a former tech leader together with the US. And this is something that for strategic reasons is a big, big problem. And the question is, how do we catch up? And that's where we have to make a bet, because we definitely in some ways can work with China, but in others we simply can't. So the interest must be to find other partners who are like-minded, who share fundamental principles that we have. They may sit in Asia, but they sit in particular in the US. And that's where, and that will be my final point really, because General McMaster asked, why is AUKUS a problem? Well, because from a European perspective, the French thought they had an agreement to build submarines. And if you suddenly realize not only can you not rely on contracts that you have signed, but you're not even informed early, but you basically learn it when everyone else learns it. That between allies is still, not the nicest thing to do.
Danielle, maybe
trust.
Danielle,
you're right, Danielle. We have one more minute.
Maybe that's what strategic autonomy looks like, Daniela. You know what I mean, you can't have it both ways, is what I'm saying. You can't have it both ways.
Last up, Bobo.
Just part of the problem is with lack of leadership is that there is, as I mentioned, a crisis of leadership that's almost the worst in just about a century. But there's also a crisis of followership. No one wants to follow the leader. I mean, maybe Australia wants to follow the United States, but really beyond that, it's very hard to find countries that really want a leader. What they want to do is maximize their strategic autonomy and flexibility to the extent that that is possible. And I think most countries, most state actors aim for that.
Well, I love your point. I often tell readers, in governments that are truly of the people, by the people, for the people, we've really only got ourselves to blame. All of our panelists, thank you, Daniela Schwarzer, Bobo Lowe, H.R. McMaster, to CEPA for a great kickoff to this fantastic forum.
I just got to say, I got to say one thing at the end here, right? This has been a downer. This has been a downer. But hey, would we trade places with 1938 or 1914? I don't think so. So I think we ought to maybe make a conscious effort to restore our confidence in what we have achieved, right? And not be so damn pessimistic, right?
Well,
we actually do have agency.
Exactly. I wrote a piece called Masters of Our Fate earlier this year. I mean, we can give in to historical determinism and take a fatalistic attitude and just say, oh, it's all so hopeless. Or we can accept that the task, although extraordinarily difficult and complex and protracted, is still within our agency. And there, General McMaster and I are as one.
Well, thank you, everyone. You know it's a great conversation when no one wants it to end. So thanks, everybody, very much. On with this terrific CEPA forum. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, David, thank you so very much for that conversation. You're fantastic. Bobo, General McMaster, Daniela, really, really outstanding conversation. For those of you that are tuning in online, of course, virtually, please be sure to sign up to a YouTube page for CEPA, where you can catch up on all the conversations, all of the clips for today. This is really a fantastic debate. And of course, we could have spent hours debating it. So thank you again, Bobo, David, Daniela, General McMaster. Just such a pleasure. And now, as we transition over, just want to again remind our audience to go to slido.com to enter in all of our conversations with polls and word clouds. We, of course, have coming up the results of our word cloud, where we asked, what is the biggest challenge facing democracy today? And in terms of results, let's see. Fantastic. It looks like quite a bit of disinformation being one of the key threats to democracy. This is fantastic. Great. And so please go ahead and go to slido.com and continue to enter your answers for these questions. And if I may just ask really quickly, can we bring up the word cloud on the screen for the audience? Fantastic. Let's see it. Fantastic. It'll just be 1 second. I don't see it. I don't see anything. Great. It looks like we're going to broadcast the results of the word cloud later on in the program. But for those of you that have not had a chance to go to slido.com, use hashtag CEPA to tune in to the conversations. We do have our second poll coming up. And the question there is fantastic. Great. So the question for poll 2 is, what should Europe prioritize to strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance? And it looks like strengthening democratic institutions is the top result right now, but please just go in and vote. There will be more results later on. Again, what should Europe prioritize to strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance? Go to slido.com, use hashtag CEPA, and we'll go from there later on. I'd like to take a moment to, again, thank all of our partners and supporters for CEPA Forum, Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. And of course, a special thank you to our colleagues at the Embassy of Lithuania in Washington, D.C., and our colleagues at the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Our media partners, thank you so much for working with us in this event, Defense One, Euractiv, and Politico. And once again, reminding you all that if you have not been able to catch any of the videos today, any of the conversations, discussions, keynotes, storytellers, you can go to YouTube and tune into CEPA's page there, where you will see all of the clips later on, and follow using hashtag #FitToLead to tune into the conversations on all social media platforms. And now it is my pleasure to introduce a conversation with Carl Gershman, former president of the National Endowment for Democracy, joined by our president and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, as he reflects on nearly 40 years of service. That will be followed by a heartfelt tribute to Jim Denton, for which our Jim Denton Transatlantic Leadership Fellowship is named after, and who was a true mentor, true leader for the next generation of leaders of the transatlantic leaders. And so really fantastic conversations coming up. Over to Carl.
Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and welcome to this really special fireside chat with Carl Gershman, now the former president of the National Endowment for Democracy. Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this conversation. I don't think Carl requires a lot of introduction, but for those of you who are just tuning in to this special edition of the CEPA Forum, Carl Gershman was the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, for 37 years. Over his many decades of service, Carl became an iconic figure in Washington, D.C. for his engagement on democracy promotion, democratic values and principles, and really ushered NED through many years since its founding of difficulties in the global realm of democracy, including, of course, the end of the Cold War, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Arab Spring, and many other developments across the world that challenged the very nature of democratic values and principles. But during Carl's time at the helm of the NED, the NED grew to become something quite unique. It was initially inspired, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit today, by some of the German political institutes, but the institution in the United States grew to be something much more than that. And it's for affiliated institutes that have political party affiliations, also grew to be something quite unique. And all of that was thanks to Carl's strategic leadership, his vision, and his undying commitment to democratic values and principles. And it strikes me that today we find ourselves in a very similar situation, perhaps, that we found ourselves when you first perhaps took over the National Endowment for Democracy in 1984, Carl, where the very principles of democratic governance are challenged on a daily basis, where we have rising models of authoritarianism emanating from China and, of course, Russia. And the NED, under your leadership, has been at the forefront of asking, how do we respond? How do we ensure that democracy remains a appealing and also dominant form of governance for the world? As perhaps frustrating as democracy can be, it is still an expression of governance that allows the ultimate freedom and liberties for the people that live in democratic institutions. So Carl, thank you again for joining us. And I wanted to start us off by asking you to reflect on your almost 4 decades of service at the NED. You were at the helm since 1984. Can you take us back to that time? The world looked very different then, of course, than it does today, but there are some similarities I mentioned. So what prompted you to take on this mission of promoting democracy? It was a controversial move at the time. So can you take us back to that moment when you took over this fledgling initiative by President Reagan and invested and grew it to what it became today?
Thanks, Alina. It's great to be with you, and I'm just delighted at the relationship that the NED has had with CEPA. It was a very, very different period then than it is now. Actually, it was a much more optimistic period. Reagan went to Westminster and gave an address that a president couldn't give today. It just is unthinkable, the Westminster address. He talked about the democratic revolution that was starting in the world. Not everybody saw it, but later on, Sam Huntington called it the third wave of democratization, which was the greatest expansion of democracy in history. And the NED was created. It would be very, very difficult to imagine people coming together and creating something like the NED today. And it was really our rivals that were in deep crisis. And Reagan talked about it in the Westminster address. And also, I can remember a meeting that we had at NED. We had just gotten started. I think it was in 1986. And we brought together a lot of Soviet specialists. Zbig Brzezinski chaired the meeting. We had Leo Labitz there, Walter Laqueur, Maurice Friedberg, Dick Pipes was there to look at our programs in the Soviet Union. We wanted to, evaluate what we were doing. It was very early. And I remember that Zbig said at the meeting that the Soviet Union was no longer trying to penetrate and through its propaganda into the Western countries. They were being very, very defensive because they were afraid of Western ideas coming into the Soviet Union, which of course they were. And of course, the Soviet Union collapsed just 5 years later. So it was a very, very different period. And I got my start well before that as a political activist in a social democratic political movement that was strongly anti-communist and believed in carrying out the ideological struggle for democracy against communism. And when Daniel Patrick Moynihan was UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, we connected with him. He wrote an article in the American Scholar which said that it was really the social democrats and the labor movement that knew best how to make the case for America, because they knew the alternative and they were also acculturated to the realm of ideology where that case had to be presented. So that was sort of the background, and we connected with people fighting for certainly dissidents, but also around the world to support them, people who were fighting for freedom and democracy. And it was a period when democracy was beginning to take off in the late 1970s. Huntington said the third wave began in '74 with the revolution in Portugal. And then finally, I went afterwards, right before NED, I went to work for Jeane Kirkpatrick at the UN, and we just continued the struggle there. And I can remember giving my first speech to the third committee here. That we really had an audience. Before we were just talking to ourselves, but we really had an audience. And the issue was self-determination. And I talked about the Soviet Empire. You weren't supposed to do that at the end at the UN, and I got interrupted repeatedly by the ambassador from Bulgaria, from Belarus, and the Soviet Union. And I talked about the Soviet Empire, and they had to set aside a whole session of the third committee, 3 hours, for 19 rights of reply to my first speech. So that was what went before, but it really did, prepare me for what then became, NED. And so when I came to NED, I tried to continue that work.
So Carl, you've said before, just as a follow-up to this, that the NED wasn't supposed to be, it was important that it wasn't seen as anti-communist, but instead as pro-democratic.
Very good point, very good point.
Can you talk about why that was such an important distinction,
Yes.
and why it was even controversial at the time?
I mean, the NED was not a Cold War institution. It was really an institution looking to the future, and it really was not what it's against; it's what it's for. And you have to say you're for democracy, and it also was a more consensual way of putting it. We were not to be an ideological organization in the sense that we were going to be fighting the kind of battle that I fought in the way I fought it when I was at the Social Democrats and at the U.S. mission to the UN. But by supporting Democrats around the world, we would be carrying forward those values, but in a consensual way, because we had to build a bipartisan consensus with liberals and conservatives.
You mentioned Sam Huntington earlier. You mentioned him in other interviews as well. And of course, he's famous for a lot of things. And one of the things he's most famous for is this idea of the waves of democratization, right? That you alluded to, the notion that throughout the arc of history, we've had moments when we've seen sort of explosions of a conversion and transformation to democracy. And the biggest one being the so-called third wave that you said started in the 70s. And of course, we have a huge explosion of democratic countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. But since then, there's been some research and thinkers who've suggested that we're actually in a counter wave now, that we're in a wave of autocratization. Where do you think where's the pendulum now?
Well, Sam did say that every wave was followed by a reverse wave. At least that's what the book is about. Yes. And although this has been an issue of contention among our little world, Larry Diamond referred to a democracy recession and refused to use the term reverse wave. But I think more recently he has used the term reverse wave. And I think it's fair to say that we are now in a reverse wave. And you just have to look at the Freedom House survey for 2020, which this was the 15th consecutive year of a decline in political and civil liberties in the world. And the number of countries where freedom and civil liberties declined was great. The number of countries exceeded the number of countries where it improved by a greater number than ever before. In other words, it's getting worse and getting worse more rapidly. And I regret to say that I think 2021 might see a continuation of that with some of the trends that are taking place in obviously Afghanistan and Tunisia and elsewhere. This is very, very worrisome. And it's obviously been made worse by COVID. The autocrats have used COVID to justify a further clampdown on freedoms, but also COVID has just destroyed the economies in certain countries. It's devastated Latin America. So you have backsliding in countries like Peru and others in Latin America because of the difficult economic circumstances. I had hoped, and I still hope, that that the United States can take advantage of the fact that we have far and away the best vaccines to help vaccinate the world and to make this something like the way we geared up for World War II, with billions and billions of vaccines. If we could do that, because these vaccines are the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, they're so vastly superior to the Chinese vaccines. I mean, Kim Jong-un just said North Korea will not take the Chinese vaccines because the American vaccines are effective. And if we could get those vaccines around to the world, I think it would just change the political dynamics. And also, look, this, I think it's the issue of the possible lab leak in Wuhan as the source of the pandemic is becoming now a much, much more prominent issue. I don't know that this will ever be proven, but certainly China's effort to cover that up, to prevent any discussion of that, and it's generally hostile behavior to the world and very aggressive behavior, is not helping its own narrative in the world. So there's a possibility for a change, but it's going to take real determined action and leadership by us, especially on the vaccine front, if this is going to happen.
So Carl, to follow up on this notion of democratic reversal or recession, perhaps I still remain somewhat more optimistic, and I'm not ready to go to full reversal yet. But certainly we've seen democratic recession, backsliding, decay, whatever we want to call it, in countries where we were anticipating at the end of the Cold War to really be the lights of democratic transformation. Of course, these are the post-socialist states of Central Eastern Europe. But now we are seeing some really concerning trends on democracy in some of these countries. But I've heard you say before that even in those places, we need to examine the opportunities for taking the next steps. So what opportunities do you see in these countries that were once held up as the bastions of democratic transition, transformation, that are now seeing some quite worrisome reversal trends? Countries Central Eastern Europe and even Belarus, perhaps, which is going through a quite significant struggle for democratic freedom right now, which is looking less optimistic, unfortunately.
Well, I've always believed that you can take the next step. Sometimes people say, can you have democracy in this very difficult place? And I've said, well, it's a long, long struggle, but you can always take the next step. And in a way, when you think about it, that's what the NED has done, because what is a proposal which we would support with a grant is a next step. What would you do in this situation to try to improve the situation? And that's what we do. And I believe that that's possible everywhere. We've had a very vigorous program in North Korea. You can't find a more difficult place than that. But what we've done in North Korea over more than 20 years has been extraordinary in opening North Korea up. And the progress that I think has been made is extraordinary, even though it's a very, very long-term process. So when you look at a country like Belarus, which is so difficult, you first have to recognize that there now is an international consensus on the illegitimacy of the Lukashenko regime. And that's very, very important. And you can use that and pressure that. Russia, which has its own troubles, won't be able to prop him up forever. There is talk about an election possibly taking place before the end of the year. If that's going to happen, you really want the Western countries to observe that election, to try to turn that kind of a thing into an opportunity. Belarus is a country with with what happened on August 9th, the election and then the uprising, the revolution. It's a nation reborn. There's a civic awakening in Belarus. I've seen some polls recently, very interesting, where 14% of the people have participated in the protests, and over 70% of the people are on social media to get their news, as opposed to the state media. So that's quite remarkable, and that shows that there's an awakening of the population, and you have real heroes who are in prison now. People like Yulia Slutskaya, the journalist, Andrei Alikovsky, and Alice Bialetsky, the human rights defender. These are heroes, and they are supported by the Belarusian people, and they should be supported, by people in the West. Belarus is a country that has awakened, and they continue to support the democracy movement. And you have people who are in prison, like Yulia Slutskaya, the journalist, and Andrei Alessandru. These are people who are heroes for freedom and democracy, and they're supported by the people in Belarus. And I think that the international community should be showing solidarity with these people. You go to a country like Ukraine. In Ukraine, it's an irreversible situation. Everything Putin has done is, really strengthened a sense of Ukrainian nationalism, and democracy continues in Ukraine. It's not going to reverse. You had a free and fair election, and in 2019, which was followed up by local and parliamentary elections. You have a process of decentralization, the establishment of anti-corruption institutions. Ukraine, too, is a country with a very active civic sector, and it's not going to change. And even in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, polls show that young people overwhelmingly are not happy with the backsliding. In Slovakia, it's different, where Slovakia has had a better situation than in these other three countries in Central Europe. And you have young people, politicians who are, looking to raise money from individuals, not from oligarchs. They're on social media. This is a culture that's changed. By the way, this has happened globally. I mean, one reason you have this, the continuation of an uprising in a country like Burma is that the young people in Burma have become much more modern. They're on social media. In Afghanistan, the enormous changes that have taken place. So Central Europe is not different. You have, political leaders there like Maya Sandu and Susanna Shaputova, who, represent a kind of political renewal in these countries. So even though it's a tough period, I don't believe that it's going to, there aren't opportunities and that you can't get progress in the future.
I want you to talk a little bit about the challenge that Russia represents. I think it's quite common now to really think about China as the biggest problem. And I've heard you say before that, yes, Russia's a problem, it's a declining power. But even so, it continues to wreak havoc across the world. Cyber attacks, ransomware attacks originating from Russia continue. Of course, Russia occupies Ukraine and Georgia, and we have the continuous frozen conflicts in other parts of the world like Moldova as well. How should policymakers try to balance the Russia-China challenge?
Well, it's very difficult. And first, let me say that the NED was declared undesirable in 2015. And legal penalties were declared against anyone who would work with us. But frankly, our view was that if people want to work with us, we'll work with them. They're the ones who have to determine whether or not to take the risk. And our program has actually expanded. Our programs in Russia have actually expanded since 2015. We did not turn away. Some others did turn away, and they, those with offices were kicked out. But we don't have offices, so we couldn't be kicked out. And we continue to be very, very active there. I think that, I think it's been very important that President Biden has said that he really wants to put new emphasis on the difference between authoritarianism and democracy, and to support democracy against authoritarianism, which is great. And he's also going to be convening a democracy summit. I regret that what has happened in Afghanistan is a grave setback to that policy. And I think the speech that he gave after the exit, where he talked about the focus just on national security interest, is going to have to be developed further so that we can put that into a larger context. What is the relationship between our security and freedom and democracy and the preservation of democratic global norms? That's very important. regarding, how the United States can deal with both of these countries at, simultaneously, there is a very lively, still, even though Putin has repressed this very badly, there is still an opposition there. I remain, in agreement with my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza that this opposition is not going away. It's deeply embedded in the young people in Russia. The economic situation is not very good. Putin is a nervous dictator. He's a nervous dictator. From a security standpoint, I agree with my friend Radek Sikorski, who wrote, recently in The Economist, that it's a good thing for Europe to try to develop a kind of strategic autonomy in defending itself against Russia, free the United States a little bit more to deal with China, which is the major threat to freedom in the world. But Russia is also a problem, and I think they work with each other. And I think what the democracies have to do is to work with each other as well, and to coordinate in this kind of a way. And I would hope that there can be greater cooperation between the Transatlantic Alliance and the Indo-Pacific Alliance to bring Asia and the transatlantic world closer together in support of democracy and also in the defense of Taiwan, which is now, after Afghanistan, in much greater jeopardy than before. And I think the United States is going to need our European allies in defending Taiwan and also working together with Taiwan, which is a vigorous democracy, in support of democracy elsewhere in Asia.
So let's dig in a little bit more on China then. You are one of the select few who've been sanctioned by the Chinese government, and you've clearly been at the forefront of Beijing's disdain for Western democracy and the kind of promotion efforts that the West is engaged in. The PRC's justification for your designation was over the Nan's operations in Hong Kong, which was seen as a significant democratic erosion, which has seen significant democratic erosion in the last few years since Beijing's takeover. In what ways do you think the situation in Hong Kong is emblematic of a broader struggle in supporting democracy movements in a surveillance state like China?
Well, certainly Xi Jinping thought it was. They saw Hong Kong as a potential Trojan horse, bringing these values in an organized way into China, and they have tried to suppress that. And so far, they've been successful. We'll see what will happen. Xi Jinping and the regime is actually fearful of democratic values. The first thing that he did when he became the president of China was to issue document number 9, which called for an intensification of the struggle against liberal values, civil society, independent media, constitutional government. They saw that as the great threat to this regime, and they're very, very fearful about it. And that's why they have such very tight repression. The question is, can they succeed? You just had the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party on July 1st, and we organized a big event on that occasion. And all of the specialists we brought together, Elizabeth Economy, Andy Nathan, Min Jin Pei, Perry Link, all of them agreed that this was a system that was in crisis, and that while totalitarianism can delay the process of opening by building up a middle class through the economic development that would demand greater freedom, while it can delay that, ultimately it can't prevent it. And as China becomes more isolated, as the security situation worsens, it's going to be in a position where it's going to have to devote more resources to its security, to its military. And Min Jin Pei, for one, is somebody who talked about a potential collapse in China. So the regime is not secure. Perry Link, in fact, in the discussion that we had on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, compared the Xi regime with its very centralized structure, with its very repressive and aggressive posture, with two Chinese dynasties, one in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and the other in the 7th century in the Common Era. Two dynasties that were short-lived. One lasted 18 years, the other 37 years, but they were short because they were just too autocratic, too centralized. And you just even had a statement by George Soros. I saw it only yesterday, a statement saying that Xi Jinping has lost touch with economic reality. The crackdown on the private businesses is going to lead, in his view, to a crash. So we don't know what's going to happen in China, and we shouldn't assume that just because Xi Jinping is flexing his muscles and introducing the surveillance state and the social credit system, which tries to reward and punish people according to their obedience, that this is going to work, and that the Xi regime is here to stay.
Yeah, authoritarian states are stable until they're not.
And that could happen the problem is it could happen very, very quickly. And it could be very destabilizing and dangerous for the world, but we should not assume that the Xi Jinping regime is here forever.
Well, I think that is a good point of optimism in some ways,
Yes.
actually, Carl. So thank you. I now want to go to a question from a CEPA fellow, a former Reagan-Fassel fellow of the NED, and a good friend and colleague of mine and yours as well, Carl, Peter Krako.
Hi, Carl, and thank you for all the work you have done in the last decades. And I would have only a simple question to you. Who were the most inspiring politicians, activists, intellectuals, public intellectuals you have met while you were leading NED? And please name 3 of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's great to see you, and it was wonderful having you at NED, even virtually, as a Reagan-Fassel fellow. It's very hard. You limit me to 3 people, and I think I know who those 3 people are, but there are many others that I just want to mention. The Dalit activist in Nepal, Subhash Darnal, who I've written about him and was just an extraordinary activist. I compared him to my mentor, Bayard Rustin, the civil rights leader, who is another person that I would think about, and the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, and so many others. The Cuban, I never met Osvaldo Paya, but he is somebody also who is in that rare category, the Cuban leader. But if I had to mention 3, one would be the Dalai Lama, who I think has been able, in the most remarkable way, to transform his exile into a gift for humanity. He said he's the unluckiest Dalai Lama because he's lived his life mostly in exile, but here he's given so much to the world. And the second was his very, very good friend, and just an extraordinary leader, Václav Havel, who I did get to know, and then work very, very closely with his people. And the Forum 2000 continues to be a force for international democracy today. Havel created it with Elie Wiesel back in 1996, but it was Havel that nominated Liu Xiaobo for the Nobel Peace Prize. And even though I didn't meet Liu Xiaobo, I want to name him as the third because, again, I've indirectly known him. I've met his widow, Liu Xia, and Liu Xiaobo was an incredible voice for democracy. He was the most important voice for democracy in the world, in my view, since the beginning of the 21st century. And it's very important to underline the fact, especially in light of what some people have said about Asian values, that he is Asian. He comes from a Confucius society, but yet he was the most eloquent and important voice for freedom and democracy, I think, in the world. And of course, the Chinese regime arrested him, prevented him from going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, kept him in prison, and in effect, really murdered him.
I now want to go to a question from CEPA Senior Fellow, the founder of the European Academy of Diplomacy and the co-founder of the Warsaw Security Forum, coming to us from Poland, Katarzyna Pisarska.
Dear Carl, you have dedicated a lifetime of service to defending democracy. And there were some amazing moments like 1989 in my region, Central Europe, when democracy flourished and grew. But what we have been seeing over the last few years is a democratic recession throughout the spectrum. When you look back in the last 3 decades of your service, and if there's one thing that you would wish you have done differently, what would that be?
Well, I've talked about it a little already. Thank you very much, Katarzyna. I've talked about it a little bit already, and that's China. I feel that I did not appreciate early enough where China was headed. I mean, there was this naive hope based upon what you might call the East Asian model of democratic development, that economic growth and modernization would lead to democracy. It was Liu Xiaobo, who I've just talked about, who warned in an essay in 2006 that if China grew as a dictatorship, it would represent a threat to democracy and liberal values all over the world. I didn't quite see it. It also had a devastating effect, the way we, in a sense, exported so many millions of jobs to China. It had a devastating effect on our own democracy. Some of my trade union friends talked about that in the 90s, and I was not 100% in agreement with them, even though I saw what was happening, because I thought that this was inevitable and would ultimately liberalize China. I think it will, perhaps, in the long run, and that is my great hope. But for the time being, the effect of China's rise, China's growth, has been to provide more resources for China and to strengthen its military and its economy, and to make it a much more dangerous country for the world. And I feel I don't think we would have done, Ned would have done anything differently, because Ned was always supporting Liu Xiaobo and all the writers and activists and people trying to use whatever spaces existed in China to expand those spaces. So I don't think it would have changed anything we did, but I feel somehow that I should have had a better early appreciation of that than I did.
Honorable Mr. Gershman, you've already written so many outstanding pages of your life, the whole history, especially in your capacity as the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. So therefore, let me ask you, during your lifetime and your service, did you manage to come to the conclusion what democracy is?
Thank you, Olga. That's a great question. I don't think it's very hard to understand what democracy is. Democracy is the only system that really allows for the flourishing of human dignity, human individuality, human freedom. It doesn't work in any other system. It's very complex. It's very difficult to make it work, but it's the only system that allows people to have dignity and to determine their own destiny within, obviously within a framework of rules that respects the dignity of others. And I think it's because people want freedom, people want to have their dignity respected, that democracy is continuing to progress. As Tocqueville saw when he wrote a long, long time ago, that this is almost a providential force in the world that's going to continue to progress. And the great question that faces all of us is, as equality progresses, how do we preserve liberty? That's the great challenge that we all face. And my dear friend Leszek Kolakowski wrote brilliantly about that. And I think that balancing these goods of equality and liberty is the great challenge that we all face.
Well, Carl, thank you. That was a true tour de force.
Oh, well.
Sobering analysis in some points, but I also think there are moments of optimism in our conversation as well. And given the many years that you've committed of your life and for your many years of service in the interest of democracy and values and principles, and at the end, the greater human liberty and greater human freedom. I mean, that is what democracy is truly about, as you said. It's about the greater equality, greater openness, greater ability for us to be able to freely express ourselves as individuals in the full meaning of that term. I know that the NED will continue on with the incredibly powerful, impactful foundation that you and everyone else, I know institutions don't get built by just one person. I know it takes many hands, and I know you have an incredible group of people at the NED that will continue to be the torchbearers for the next generation. And I certainly hope that we return to optimism in the years ahead, and in even the hardest and darkest moments, that we retain the inspiration that I think you have laid the foundation for, and others have laid the foundation for, And I just want to thank you for sharing your reflections with us, sharing your ideas. I know you'll continue to share your ideas in the years ahead. I look forward to reading more from you as you take up more writing and more intellectual thinking. And thank you for being such a light here in Washington, but really across the world, and for continuing the fight for freedom. It never ends, does it?
No.
And thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, Alina. Great pleasure.
Thank you, Carl.
Good luck.
Jim Denton was a special and unique personality. Like no one else I know, he had this uncanny ability to understand that what really matters for the Transatlantic Alliance is people. And he could bring people together in a way like no one else really could. And he had this uncanny ability to identify the next generation of emerging leaders. To me, he was a mentor, a dear friend, and someone who I can honestly say, without whose advice I would not be where I am today. And I think he served that function, and he was in that role to so many, dozens and dozens of people over his lifetime.
And Jim was somebody with a very, very deep commitment to democratic values. I sometimes thought that what Jim did, what he said, it was coming from his soul. And I think people appreciated how deep this commitment was. He was part of a small band of people who shared this very, very deep commitment, and they respected Jim for what he was.
Jim Denton was a remarkable talent scout. He had an eye for finding young men and women who had the passion, the determination, and the smarts to be effective champions for democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. He built a remarkable community, people who helped advance freedom in their own nations and supported democracy around the world. I had the chance to benefit from Jim's work by meeting with many of those that he gathered, by hiring some, by being inspired by all.
In 1989, as the events in Eastern Europe unfolded, Jim was really gung-ho to help these fledgling democracies, collapsing communist states, to have a successful path forward. And he knew the value of ideas and youth and principles.
We must recognize and remember the people who helped to make this happen and who had dedication and persistence to bring Eastern Europe closer to the United States. This is why I'm humbled and honored to have known Jim Denton.
Jim Denton was an amazing human being whom I was proud to call a friend. He has devoted the last decade of his life to convening young transatlantic leaders in the pursuit of strengthening the NATO Transatlantic Alliance, but also in the pursuit of democratic values.
James Denton was a citizen of the world who not only cared deeply about the unity of transatlantic partnerships, but who also fought for promoting the mutual understanding of all people around the globe. He was a real defender of democracy and human freedom.
Although I never had the pleasure of meeting James Denton personally, I know that he had a great respect for our region and Hungary. He completely understood the unique geopolitical and historical role of Central Europe and the V4 on the world stage. For me, people like him are a great inspiration.
Jim Denton was a truly extraordinary person. He was very passionate. He was so committed to strengthening transatlantic partnerships. Jim was great in building bridges and connecting people.
Denton was a great eminence who put strings in the background, organizing events, funding institutes, and connecting people with each other. He worked tirelessly, not only building bridges among young politicians, thinkers, journalists, and scientists of Eastern Central Europe and the United States of America. He also helped link past, present, and future.
We were talking one-on-one for several hours in a row, and the motivation he enriched me with gave me a pure vision for the years ahead. And Jim gave me an advice which I am keeping to till today. He told me, you should push the button, apply for until you feel the pain in your finger. And when you feel the pain, you should proceed pushing.
I first met Jim in the early 90s, shortly after our first free elections in Central Europe. He was among the very first Americans to reach out to us new democracies. But in doing so, what I gained in meeting Jim was a 30-year-long friendship that was very special to me in more than one ways.
The legacy left by James Denton can only be inspirational to me. I was born in Central Europe, and when I look at the level of enthusiasm and the amount of work that James has invested into building ties between the US and Europe, and more broadly how he cared and cherished about the transatlantic link.
I do believe that we still need people like him. We had challenges back at that time with the collapse of the Soviet Union and regaining independence in Central Europe from the communist oppression, and we have different challenges nowadays.
What inspired me then about Jim, and what keeps inspiring me to this day, is his commitment to the idea of improving, solidifying, reinforcing the relations between the US and Europe.
At the same time, as I met his colleagues, his friends, and his relatives, I still got an opportunity to learn about his great personality, his passion for transatlantic partnership, his friendship, and his hospitality.
So when I had a chance to go to DC, being a part of James Denton Transatlantic Fellowship Program, it opened completely new perspectives, organizations, and personal contacts.
I wish all the people in CEPA, and I wish the Denton Fellowship to grow, to expand even during these trying times.
The transatlantic community needs people like Jim Denton, and what he's working for is important, bringing Central and Eastern Europeans and Americans together.
I would like to express my gratitude to CEPA, but also to Mr. James Denton for his work and the legacy that he left behind.
So Jim has left an immense legacy in those people, in us, in the young leaders, both in Central Europe and in the United States, who are today friends, but also brothers in arms. Jim, we miss you very much, and we owe you so much.
We remember you, Jim. We thank you for your efforts, and we honor them today.
And without him and his commitment to values, to the people connections that undergird those values, we would not have the cohort of the next transatlanticists that we see emerging today. And much of that had to do with Jim's just belief in people, that people really matter, that every person matters, that a single person can make the difference.
He had a terrific convening capacity. He could bring people together, and he always brought people together. Even really at the end of his life, he was still bringing people together when he was very ill and not feeling well. But he still wanted. He thought that the convening of people was a way of strengthening the overall work. And I feel privileged for having known Jim and been his friend, and for that I'm forever grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much to James's colleagues, friends, and to our Denton alumni for that heartfelt tribute to his life of service. Now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our final segment continuing with the theme of leading with our values and the fight for democracy and democratic values in the face of authoritarianism. It is my pleasure to introduce Foreign Minister Edgars Rinkēvičs of Latvia and Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis of Lithuania as they give way as we celebrate the award of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya on behalf of the women of Belarus as our Freedom Fighter Award of 2021. Over to you, ministers.
Dear friends, it is my honor and pleasure to speak at this year's CEPA Forum. Latvia and the European Union very much appreciate the new momentum that is being built in the Transatlantic Alliance. The world is facing urgent challenges, such as climate change, pandemics, economic and humanitarian crises. Amid these challenges, there is a slow-moving but fundamental threat that I wish to focus on today, namely the threat to democracy. In 1991, the Baltic states had just regained their independence through nationwide peaceful manifestations. Namely, 2 million people created a human chain across the territory of the three states. The willingness to live in democracy was very clear at the time. The contrast between autocracy and democracy remains in the memory of a single generation. Among the many lessons that can be drawn from the occupation years of the Baltic states, I want to emphasize a couple. Firstly, the value of democracy becomes strikingly clear when one is suddenly being deprived of the rule of law, freedom of speech, or the right to vote. Secondly, it is often forgotten that the turn to authoritarianism has not only a remarkably high humanitarian, but also economic price. We are pleased that our experience of rebuilding democratic institutions at the beginning of the 90s serves others well today. We gladly share it with countries in the region such as Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. The democratic ideal that helped establish and later restore the statehood of Latvia is currently, just like it was then, threatened by the proliferation of expansionist authoritarian ideologies that support the philosophy of coercive power and influence. On top of that, today we witness a new environment in which foreign policy takes place. Digitalization, on the one hand, brings new opportunities for greater political participation and transparency. On the other hand, it has helped authoritarian regimes to spread disinformation. Cyber attacks on democratic institutions are increasingly common. Elections are being meddled with. The conflict between democracies and authoritarian regimes can be witnessed in our region. Take Belarus. A year ago, we witnessed stolen presidential elections in Belarus. This has also been a year of ongoing peaceful protests by Belarusian society, demanding respect for its human rights and fundamental democratic freedoms that those elections were lacking. Throughout the year, Alexander Lukashenko's regime has been persistently cracking down on free media and non-governmental organizations. Human rights defenders, journalists and members of the opposition have been arrested or forced into exile. By hijacking an aircraft of a European Union airline this May, and by using illegal migration as a weapon against its neighbors in the European Union, Lukashenko's regime demonstrates that it has also become a threat to international security. Escalation in human rights violations can also be witnessed in Russia. The Russian authorities continued exerting pressure on human rights defenders, public activists and organizations, and against members of the free and independent press. It highlights a continuous negative trend in Russia's approach over the years to persecute opposition and independent civil society representatives. In response to violence and human rights violations, Latvia and the EU have been gradually stepping up sanctions pressure. The sanctions imposed by countries in the Transatlantic Alliance must continue to signal that there is no place for human rights abuses in the world today. And we have been very transparent about the adopted sanctions. We have to remember that the fight for democracy starts in our own societies. The first step that the transatlantic community can take in safeguarding democracy is to remind ourselves of the value and fragility of democracy. We are far from a world with societies free of corruption, human rights abuses, and disinformation. This December, the EU will be joining forces with the US administration in organizing the Summit for Democracy. This action-oriented and high-level event will be invaluable for increasing progress in this area. COVID-19 pandemic has been a time of diminished transparency and increased turmoil to the detriment of democratic institutions. We are now learning to live in the new environment. It is time to return to conference rooms, multilateral meeting tables, and to strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance in the face of emerging challenges. Along with these activities, we must pursue ever more active practice of transparency, explaining decisions and ambitions, finding ways of reaching out to those who think differently. Leading by example is the right way to go. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish for you to have fruitful discussions during this year's forum.
Thank you for the possibility to talk, and I have a feeling that the theme of transatlantic relations has become very, very important, and rightfully so, because probably for the first time in a very long time, democracy feels under attack. It feels as if democratic space started shrinking. To answer the question, why is that? We have to start and look into the autocratic regimes who currently started presenting themselves not as 50 years ago the Soviet Union has, but differently. They present themselves as effective second choice for the countries that would choose a future for themselves. And suddenly, democracy, rule of law, basic human rights doesn't feel as the only solution for the countries deciding their own future. The most worrying fact is when these notions and ideas creep up on the countries who are democratic, who are part of EU, NATO, or been democratic for quite some time. When they start, when the political forces within those countries start raising questions, is our chosen path is really the one? Why could not we choose a different path that's been offered by China and other countries? It could be even more effective. And these threats, I think they are real. And this is high time when we as a democratic community have to pull together and decide what our answer should be. And how do we expand the space and provide a safe space for countries deciding their own future? And this begins very close to, I would say to my heart, but also geographically close to Lithuania's borders, in Belarus. We need to provide a very clear answer to the people in Belarus that they have a democratic future that would be based on rule of law and human rights. We have to extend our invitation to the countries of Eastern Partnership that they have a European perspective and European path that they were looking for and waiting for so long. And we have to make sure that the democracies across the globe who are looking for partnership, who are looking for support from the Western community, from the transatlantic community, that they have friends and partners across the globe. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA. The theme throughout today has been democratic resilience and the urgent need for transatlantic democracies to work together in the fight against authoritarianism. Together, we must not slip into transactionalism that will eventually lead to accommodation of autocracy and repression. Today, the battle for democracy, the battle for freedom, is being fought across the world and on European soil. Brave individuals, activists, journalists, and political leaders fight back every day against insurmountable odds. They risk their freedom, their safety, and their lives. They remind us that we can never take democracy for granted, because democracy isn't an end state. It's won and sustained through a daily struggle. CEPA has been honored to recognize the courage of these brave individuals with our Freedom Fighter Award. Freedom fighters embody the spirit of democratic resilience. With this award, CEPA recognizes those who go above and beyond the call of duty, who speak truth to power and inspire others. And no one embodies the spirit more than the women of Belarus, whose courage and fearless determination to protect against fraudulent elections in their country captured the imagination of the world. While Belarusians from all walks of life joined the protests, it was groups of women who led the struggle. It was women whose faces were seen and whose voices were amplified around the world. They held flowers and the flag of the Belarusian People's Republic at weekly protests, even as they risked arrest, harassment, and beatings by security forces. Despite the profound risks, they were never deterred. And we are particularly honored to have with us Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya, leader of a democratic Belarus, to accept the Freedom Fighter Award on behalf of all the women of Belarus. Ms. Tsikhanovskaya experienced the brutal repression of Alexander Lukashenko's dictatorship firsthand. She ran for president against an unjust regime, an election that she would have won. Today, she is in fact the rightful, democratically elected leader of Belarus, but one who must live in exile to continue the fight for democracy. Ms. Tsikhanovskaya has become a beacon for democracy activists around the world who've been inspired by her vision and her words. She has rallied the world in support of her country and reminded us what the fight for democracy truly means. On behalf of all of us at CEPA, thank you, Svetlana, for your courage and leadership, and for joining us at the 2021 CEPA Forum to accept this award. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm profoundly honored to receive the Center for European Policy Analysis Freedom Fighter Award on behalf of Belarusian women. This is the second time that the Freedom Fighter Award is given to those who fight for freedom in Belarus. Last time, it was our Lithuanian friend Linas Linkevičius. This is a precious sign of support from the international community. But the fight is far from over yet. Last summer and autumn, the streets in Belarus were filled with hundreds of thousands of protesters. The regime responded with violence. Since August 2020, more than 36,000 people have gone through administrative arrests. At least 10 people lost their lives in our struggle. And 0 investigations into policy brutality have been launched. My country has turned into a big prison where the whole nation is daily abused by a bunch of armed rogues. But our unquenchable desire to live in a free country didn't go anywhere. No policeman's baton can beat this out of us. Belarusians protest in the ways available to them, and even those unfairly imprisoned are defiant even behind prison bars. Let me illustrate this with the example of one special Belarusian woman, Volga Zolotai. She's my age, and she's a mother of 5. Last summer, she became a leader of her neighborhood community in Minsk. She organized evening courtyard gatherings for her neighbors to drink tea, listen to music, and talk about news. The regime considered it a crime. In March, Volga was arrested when she was taking her 10-year-old daughter to school. She was accused, and I quote, of organizing an extremist group. Investigators beat her to make her confess the crimes she didn't commit. She's a person of strong faith, but she wasn't allowed to see a priest for 2 months. But despite the 6 months in prison, Volga's will is not broken. She walks out with her cellmates and writes letters to her kids. In her letters she writes, "However tall and strong the walls are, I still feel free. I have a clear conscience and a loving family." Despite the pressure, she doesn't cooperate with the investigation and does not confess to the untrue allegations. This is what fighting for freedom truly means. The story of Volga Zolotai is just one among 667 other recognized political prisoners. 75 of them are women, and these numbers are growing daily. Those are the people that I would like to dedicate this award to. We have a responsibility to make sure that the 5 kids of Volga see their mother free as soon as possible. We must not lose focus. So I urge the democratic community to adopt assistance programs to Belarusian civil society, in particular to human rights defenders, media, and activists. We must make sure sanctions are enforced and loopholes are removed. We must not permit trade of political prisoners. Volga's family should know that her freedom is not a bargaining chip. We must be brave and united in defending the values that the struggle of Belarusians embodies: freedom and democracy. Even behind prison bars and facing extraordinary pressure, Volga stands in defiance to dictatorship. So our actions should be up to this high standard. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Tihanovskaya, and thank you to Ministers Frankovich and Landsbergis for their remarks today. As we close out our program, I have poll 2 results. Again, the question was, what can Europe do to prioritize to strengthen the Transatlantic Alliance? And overwhelmingly, we have strengthen democratic institutions, exactly as the Biden administration. So that's something that we align in. Thank you to everyone that has contributed to the poll questions today. Again, we'll be back tomorrow with them. And for those of you that are just tuning in, it's the close of our program, but you can follow all of our social media platforms, go to CEPA.org, CEPAforum.org as well, and tune in to today's discussions. I would like to extend a special thank you again to our supporters of CEPA Forum, Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. A special thank you to our colleagues at the Lithuanian Embassy in Washington, D.C. and the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. And to our media partners for joining us, Euractiv, Defense One, and Politico. Please tune in tomorrow as we feature SACURE Todd Walters, Senator Joni Ernst, and we award the Transatlantic Leadership Award to NATO Secretary General John Stoltenberg. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and thank you for joining us.
Transatlantic unity and solidarity are vital to ensure the defense and security of NATO allies. We must always strive to strengthen the bond between Europe and North America and prepare the alliance for the future.
It's really about NATO moving to recognise how Russia's threat has changed, but also how readiness is important and how they have to configure. And then add that to NATO's new strategic plans that they're working on.
We see a world today that has emerged in which the destructive power of nuclear weapons in the kinetic world is beginning to be matched by the destructive capability of cyber, which begins, of course, in the cyber sphere, if you will, but then has significant kinetic effect.
I think the transatlantic community needs to keep in mind a simple thing. At the end of the day, there's so much more that unites us than what divides us.